1994. Fall asleep to hilarious history. The 1994 Chronicles, a year of high waters and low tomfoolery, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Low-Speed Spectacle. I have often observed that the American public possesses a singular, almost miraculous capacity for being bored, provided the boredom is served up on a grand enough scale. In my day, if you wanted to draw a crowd of 90 million souls, you generally had to promise a miracle, a war, or at the very least, a public hanging, where the condemned man had a reputation for witty last words. But by the year of our Lord 1994, the centuries do tend to blur when one is observing them from the drafty balcony of the afterlife. The standards for entertainment had undergone a most peculiar transformation. It was the 17th of June, a day that should have been remembered for the heat, or perhaps for the fact that a perfectly good game of professional basketball was being played by men who were paid more per dribble than I earned for the entirety of Huckleberry Finn. But history, as I have long suspected, is a prankster with a very low sense of humor. On this particular evening, the great American eye, that glowing, flickering cathode ray box that sits in the corner of every parlor like a petrified oracle, decided to stop showing sports and start showing a car. Not a fast car, mind you, not a sleek, thundering machine built for the daring exploits of a bandit or a hero. No, it was a white Ford Bronco, a vehicle that looks remarkably like a refrigerated shipping container that had been shrunken in the wash and fitted with wheels. And it was moving. Slowly. I have seen glaciers in the Alps move with more aggressive intent. I have seen a Missouri snapping turtle make better time toward a muddy bank than this vehicle was making down the 405 freeway in Los Angeles. And yet, the entire nation stopped. It was as if a giant invisible hand had reached down and turned the off switch on the machinery of civilization. Somewhere, I imagine, a man was in the middle of a heart attack, and the surgeon likely paused, scalpel aloft, to ask the head nurse if they'd reached the Orange County line yet. Now, the man inside this motorized bread box was one Orenthal James Simpson, a man known to the public as O.J., a moniker that suggests a refreshing breakfast beverage rather than a gentleman suspected of a most gruesome double homicide. He was a hero of the gridiron, a man who had spent his youth running through defensive lines with the grace of a gazelle escaping a lion. But on this night, he wasn't running, he was drifting. Behind him followed a fleet of police cruisers, their lights flashing with a festive rhythmic gaiety that stood in stark contrast to the somber nature of the occasion. It was a parade. There is no other word for it. It was a royal procession for the age of information, where the king is a fugitive and the court jesters are the news anchors trying to find something, anything to say, for 2 straight hours while nothing whatsoever happens. I watched this from my celestial armchair and marveled at the sheer, unadulterated humbug of it all. In my time, a police chase involved a great deal of shouting, the lathering of horses, and perhaps a stray bullet or two to keep the pulse moving. It was a brief, violent affair that concluded before you could finish your pipe. But the modern American has mastered the art of the slow-motion catastrophe. There is a particular genius in it. If you move fast, the cameras cannot focus. If you move fast, The commentators cannot speculate on your psychological state or the contents of your glove compartment. But if you move at a steady 35 miles per hour, you provide the news networks with a canvas upon which they can paint their own intricate tapestries of nonsense. "He looks tired," one announcer would say, despite the fact that the only thing visible was the rear bumper of the car. "The nation is healing," another might suggest, though I fail to see how watching a white SUV crawl through Southern California has any medicinal properties for the soul. What fascinated me most, however, was not the car or the man or the police, but the people on the overpasses. As this grim little caravan made its way south, crowds gathered on the bridges. They weren't there to protest. They weren't there to uphold the law. They were there to wave. They held up signs that said, "Go, Juice, go." An encouraging sentiment, I suppose, though I'm not sure where they wanted him to go, seeing as he was surrounded by 25 patrol cars and a dozen helicopters. It was a uniquely American moment, the celebration of the spectacle for the sake of the spectacle. We are a people who love a winner, it is true, but we love a situation even more. We would rather watch a famous man potentially commit a tragedy in slow motion than watch a common man perform a miracle in real time. I've often said that truth is stranger than fiction because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. If I had written a story about a world-famous athlete fleeing the law in a white truck while 95 million people watched him do it at the speed of a funeral march, my editor would have told me to put down the whiskey and try a more believable plot, and perhaps one involving time-traveling Connecticut Yankees or jumping frogs. But there it was. For 2 hours, the information superhighway we had been promised, a grand metaphorical path to the enlightenment of the human race, was occupied by a single man in a state of nervous collapse, driving a car that looked like a kitchen appliance. It taught me something about the coming age. I realized then that the future would not be defined by the speed of our travel or the brilliance of our inventions, but by our willingness to stare at a screen and wait for something to happen. We have become a nation of watchers. We will watch a war. We will watch a wedding, and we will certainly watch a man in a white Bronco, provided the lighting is good and the cameras are steady. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting a golden hue over the tarmac and the chrome, the Bronco finally pulled into a driveway. The chase ended not with a bang, but with a request for a glass of water and a phone call to a mother. The curtain fell, the news anchors exhaled, and the basketball game returned to the screen, though I suspect no one cared about the score anymore. We had seen the great American low-speed spectacle. We had seen a man do absolutely nothing on live television, and we had found it more gripping than any play by Shakespeare or any speech by Lincoln. It was the birth of a new kind of history, a history that doesn't happen in books, but happens in the now, even if the now is remarkably boring. I went to sleep that night, or whatever passes for sleep in this vaporous realm, thinking that if I ever decided to return to the world of the living, I wouldn't bother writing novels. I'd just buy a white truck, find a freeway, and drive very, very slowly. I reckon I'd be the most famous man in the world by nightfall. But then I remembered that the smell of a good cigar and the peace of a quiet porch are far superior to the adoration of 90 million people staring at your bumper. The modern world may have the technology to watch everything, but I fear it has lost the wisdom to see anything at all. And so, 1994 began its long, strange journey into the annals of history, led by a Ford Bronco and followed by a nation that had forgotten how to look away. Chapter 2. The Spring of the Rainbow. If you had told me in the mid-19th century that the most hopeful spot on the terrestrial ball would one day be the southern tip of Africa, I would have asked you to name your brand of whiskey so that I might avoid it. In my day, South Africa was a place primarily known for diamonds, gold, and a spectacular variety of ways for a man to be gored, bitten, or swindled. It was a land where the sun was hot. The politics were colder than a widow's heart, and the racial arrangements were so tangled and cruel they would have made a Mississippi plantation owner look like a rank amateur in the business of bigotry. But May of 1994 brought about a transformation so startling that it made the aforementioned white Bronco chase look like a minor clerical error in the ledgers of Providence. We witnessed the inauguration of Nelson Mandela as the President of South Africa. Now, I have seen many things in my travels. I have seen the Taj Mahal by moonlight. I have seen the eruption of Vesuvius. And I have seen a man eat a whole watermelon in under a minute. But I have rarely seen the universe execute such a perfect about-face without stripping its gears. Mr. Mandela was a man who had spent 27 years in a stone cell. 27 years! To put that in perspective for the modern mind, that is long enough to miss the entirety of the Beatles' career, the invention of the microwave oven, and several minor wars, and still have time left over to learn how to tolerate your cellmates' snoring. Most men, after 27 years of being treated like a dangerous piece of discarded luggage, would have emerged from prison with a heart made of flint and a list of names they intended to cross off with a heavy ink. Instead, Mandela emerged and decided to lead the very people who had locked him up. I call him the prisoner-turned-pilot. It is a title I bestow with the highest degree of riverboat reverence. You see, I spent my youth learning to read the face of the Mississippi River. I knew every snag, every reef, every shifting sandbar from St. Louis to New Orleans. I knew that a river is a living, breathing creature that wants nothing more than to tear the bottom out of your boat and drown your passengers. But steering a steamboat through a graveyard of snags, where a hidden log can end your career in a heartbeat, is a holiday in the country compared to steering a nation out of the wreckage of apartheid. A river, for all its malice, does not have opinions. A river does not harbor a 300-year-old grudge because of the color of its water. A river does not demand a seat in the cabinet or insist that the other rivers are plotting to steal its lunch. In 1994, Mandela took the wheel of a ship of state that was essentially a collection of jagged splinters held together by hope and some very precarious baling wire. He stood before a crowd in Pretoria, a city that had previously been the headquarters of the Great Wall of No, and spoke of a rainbow nation. Now, I have always had a complicated relationship with rainbows. They are beautiful, certainly, but they are notoriously difficult to lean on. They have a habit of vanishing just as you're trying to show them to a neighbor. Yet, there Mandela stood, a man who had every right to be a thunderstorm, choosing instead to be the light that makes the rainbow possible. The inauguration was a grand affair. It was attended by every dignitary, monarch, and stuffed shirt the world could muster. There were kings in silk and presidents in wool, all of them standing around looking slightly embarrassed that a man who had been a terrorist on their official paperwork 10 minutes ago was now the only adult in the room. It was a magnificent display of human flexibility. If there is one thing politicians are good at, it is the graceful pivot, that magical maneuver where they pretend they were cheering for the winner all along, even while they were secretly hoping the winner would stay in his cage. I watched the proceedings and mused on the sheer exhausting difficulty of peace. You see, any fool can start a fire. Any idiot with a match and a grievance can burn down a barn in 20 minutes. But to build that barn, to gather the timber, to square the beams, to convince the neighbors to help with the roof instead of throwing rocks at the windows, that takes a special kind of genius. It takes a man who has learned that the greatest victory you can win over an enemy is to turn him into a friend who owes you an apology. Mandela's long walk to freedom was not just a walk out of a prison gate, it was a walk through the minds of his countrymen. He had to convince the white population that they weren't going to be thrown into the sea, and he had to convince the black population that justice is a dish best served warm, with a side of reconciliation rather than cold and bloody. I suspect that if I had been in his shoes, I would have spent my first day in office ordering a very large, very sharp guillotine and a comfortable chair to watch it from. But that is why I am a writer of satires, and he was a builder of nations. Satires require a victim. Nations require a foundation. He looked out at the crowds, a sea of faces that looked like a spilled box of jelly beans, and he didn't see enemies or victims. He saw a crew, and he knew that if the ship was going to move, everyone had to pull on the same rope, even if they didn't particularly like the person standing next to them. It was a spring of hope, a spring of the rainbow. For a few brief days, the world seemed to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the human race was capable of something other than its usual routine of organized larceny and imaginative slaughter. We saw a man who had every reason to be broken, standing tall and straight, radiating a dignity that made the surrounding royalty look like they'd been bought at a discount warehouse. Of course, being a man of some experience with the darker corners of the human soul, I knew that the rainbow would eventually have to deal with the rain. You cannot fix 3 centuries of institutionalized stupidity with a single speech and a fancy hat. There would be storms ahead, economic gales, political lightning, and the inevitable discovery that some of the crew were still trying to bore holes in the hull. But for that one moment in 1994, the prisoner-turned-pilot had the wheel. He had navigated the graveyard of snags, he had avoided the reefs of revenge, and he had brought the boat into the clear water of a new era. It was a spectacle of the highest order, and for once the American public, myself included, didn't need a slow-speed car chase to keep our attention. We were watching something truly rare, a human being who was larger than his circumstances. It was a refreshing change of pace. If 1994 was going to be the year where everything changed, Mandela was the man who made sure it changed for the better, even if the rest of us were still back in the cabin arguing about the menu and wondering if the Amazon bookstore was ever going to deliver our mail. I puffed on my spectral cigar and smiled. The world is a terrible place, full of scoundrels and bores, but every now and then It produces a Mandela just to keep the rest of us from giving up on the whole business. And as the sun set over Pretoria, casting those long African shadows, I reckoned that if a man could survive 27 years in a hole and come out smiling, there might be hope for the rest of us after all, though I wouldn't bet my last dollar on it just yet. Chapter 3. The Bookstore in the Ether. I have always maintained that the human race is a collection of remarkably clever idiots, and nowhere is this more evident than in our approach to progress. In my time, progress was a thing you could see, touch, and occasionally be run over by: a locomotive, a steamboat, or a particularly aggressive printing press. But by 1994, progress had moved into a realm that I can only describe as the Great Invisible. They started calling it the Information Superhighway, which is a very grand name for a series of glowing boxes connected by wires that hum with the frantic energy of 1,000 confused telegraph operators. It was in this year that a young man named Jeff Bezos, a gentleman possessed of a high forehead and a laugh that sounds like a flock of startled seagulls, decided to start a business in his garage. Now, in America, the garage has become a sacred site, much like the log cabin of old. If you want to be a titan of industry, you must first spend a year or two tripping over a lawnmower and hiding from your wife in a drafty shed. Mr. Bezos called his venture Amazon. I find this choice of nomenclature fascinating. The Amazon is a river in South America, a vast, swirling torrent of mud, piranhas, and mosquitoes, where the primary goal of any traveler is to avoid being eaten or dissolving in the humidity. To name a bookstore after it suggests a certain level of confidence, or perhaps a warning that if you enter this digital current, you may never be seen again. His idea, as it was explained to my spectral self, was to sell books through the World Wide Web. The premise is this: instead of walking down the street to a bookstore like a sensible Christian, you sit in your pajamas, type a request into a machine, and then wait several days for a man in a brown truck to hurl a cardboard box at your front porch. Now, I have had some experience with the book trade. I have been an author, a lecturer, and, most disastrously, a publisher. I once invested a fortune in the Page Compositor, a machine so complex it required a college degree to look at and a miracle to operate. It had 30,000 parts, all of which were designed to break at the exact moment you needed them. I lost enough money on that mechanical humbug to buy a small European principality. So, when I see a man trying to reinvent the way a book reaches a reader, my first instinct is to check his pulse, and my second is to check his sanity. The modern world seems obsessed with the convenience of not having to go anywhere, but they forget that the journey is often the only part worth the price of the ticket. A bookstore is not merely a warehouse for paper. It is a sanctuary. It is a place where the air is heavy with the scent of glue, old leather, and the quiet, dignified decay of unread ideas. There is a specific kind of dust that only exists in bookstores, a scholarly dust that settles on your coat and makes you look more intelligent than you actually are. When you enter a bookstore, you are engaging in a holy hunt. You wander the aisles, your fingers trailing across the spines like a lover's touch. You pick up a volume, feel the weight of it, and inhale that intoxicating aroma of wood pulp and ink. That smell is half the pleasure of reading. It tells you that you are about to embark on an adventure that has been physically preserved for your benefit. Mr. Bezos, however, believes that the smell of a book can be replaced by the glow of a screen and the convenience of a click. He wants to turn the great library of human knowledge into a mail-order catalog. It's a bold move. I'll grant him that. He's betting on the fact that the average human being is inherently lazy, a bet that has never once lost money in the history of the world. I watched him in his garage, surrounded by packing tape and ambition, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgic skepticism. Why would anyone wait for a package to arrive by post when they could have the instant gratification of a shopkeeper's scowl and a physical copy in their hand within 20 minutes? But Mark, the ghost of the future seems to whisper, you can find any book, even the obscure ones, even the ones about the mating habits of the North American tree toad. To which I reply, if a book is so obscure that no bookstore carries it, there is usually a very good, very merciful reason for its absence. Some books are meant to be lost. Some ideas are meant to stay in the dark where they can't hurt anyone. By making every book available to every person at every moment, Bezos is essentially unleashing a flood of literature that will eventually drown the very people he's trying to serve. And then there is the matter of the search. In a real bookstore, you find things you weren't looking for. You go in for a book on history, and you come out with a volume of poetry and a manual on how to raise bees, simply because they were sitting on the shelf next to the thing you thought you wanted. It's called serendipity. It's the way the universe rewards curiosity. But on the Amazon, you are guided by an algorithm, a word that sounds like a mathematical disease. The algorithm tells you, since you like this, you will also like that. It is the death of discovery. It's like having a mother-in-law who follows you around a party and tells you which people are safe to talk to. It narrows the mind under the guise of expanding it. Furthermore, there is the social tragedy of the delivery man. In my day, if you wanted a book, you had to interact with a human being. You had to talk to the bookseller, a person who usually knew more about the contents of the shelves than the authors themselves. You could argue about a plot point or complain about the price. It was a transaction of the soul. Now, the transaction is handled by a man in a hurry who doesn't know what's in the box and doesn't care, as long as he can get back to his truck before the next click happens. We are trading the human connection for a cardboard box and a strip of plastic tape. I sat there in the ether, watching the first few orders trickle in, and I realized that I was witnessing the birth of a new kind of empire. Not an empire of land or gold, but an empire of logistics. Bezos wasn't just selling books. He was selling the idea that you never have to leave your house again. He was building a world where the consumer is a hermit and the merchant is a ghost. It is a brilliant, terrifying, and utterly hilarious development. I can only imagine what will happen when this Amazon starts selling other things. If he can sell a book, he can sell a toaster. If he can sell a toaster, he can sell a lawnmower. Eventually, he'll be selling the very air we breathe, delivered in a frustration-free package and left on the doorstep of a nation that has forgotten how to walk to the corner store. I find a certain irony in the fact that I, a man who once went bankrupt trying to automate the printing of books, am now watching a man succeed by automating the buying of them. It seems the trick wasn't to make the machines smarter, but to make the people more sedentary. As 1994 rolled on and the garage in Bellevue began to overflow with boxes, I couldn't help but laugh. The American dream used to be about conquering the frontier. Now it's about having the frontier delivered to your house in 2 to 4 business days. Mr. Bezos may have named his company after a mighty river, but I suspect he's actually building a dam. He's catching all the little streams of commerce and diverting them into his own private reservoir. It's a grand spectacle of capitalistic engineering, and while I mourn the loss of the dusty bookstore and the smell of old paper, I have to admire the sheer, unmitigated gall of it. After all, if you're going to drown the world in books, you might as well name your company after the biggest river on the map. Just don't expect me to be happy when the information superhighway turns out to be a toll road owned by a man with a garage and a dream of selling me a dictionary while I'm still in my nightshirt. I'll stick to my spectral library. Thank you very much. The books here don't require shipping. The dust is authentic, and I never have to worry about an algorithm telling me what I ought to read next. But for the rest of you, living in the now, I wish you luck. You're going to need it once the cardboard boxes start piling up higher than the steeples. And so the bookstore in the ether was born, a silent digital river that would eventually grow until it swallowed the high street whole. It's a funny old world, isn't it? We spent centuries building cities just so we could have everything in one place. And now we're spending billions just so we never have to see those cities again. I reckon I'll just sit back, light another cigar, and wait to see what else Mr. Bezos decides to put in a box. I hear he's got his eye on the stars next. I only hope the shipping isn't too expensive. Chapter 4. The Shot Heard Round the Digital World. In the spring of 1894, if a young man wanted to express his profound dissatisfaction with the universe, he generally did so by contracting tuberculosis, moving to a drafty attic in Paris, and writing sonnets about the cruelty of the moon. It was a quiet, dignified sort of despair that required a great deal of coughing into lace handkerchiefs and very little in the way of electricity. But by April of 1994, the business of being lost had undergone a radical industrialization. Despair had moved from the attic to the garage, and the lace handkerchief had been replaced by a flannel shirt that looked like it had been salvaged from the wreckage of a lumberjack's midlife crisis. The news arrived that Kurt Cobain, the reluctant prophet of a tribe called Generation X, had departed this life by his own hand. It was a shot heard round the world, though unlike the one it conquered, this one didn't signal the birth of a nation, but rather the collective sigh of a generation that wasn't entirely sure it wanted to belong to a nation in the first place. I have spent a considerable amount of time observing this Generation X, and I find the name itself to be a stroke of marketing genius. In my day, we named things with a bit of flourish. The 49ers, the Gilded Age, the Victorian era, but X? It is the mathematical symbol for an unknown quantity. It is the signature of a man who cannot write his own name. It suggests a group of people who are so thoroughly unimpressed by the options on the menu of life that they have decided to simply order the letter X and complain about the service. The anatomy of grunge. To understand Cobain, one must understand the sound he championed, which the world called grunge. I have listened to this music from my post in the ether, and I can tell you that it sounds remarkably like a steam boiler having an existential crisis. It is a cacophony of distorted guitars that groan with the weight of 1,000 unwashed dishes, accompanied by a drum beat that feels like someone falling down a very long flight of stairs while holding a collection of pots and pans. And yet, there is a strange, haunting beauty in it. I call it the Seattle Sound. Seattle being a city where it rains so frequently that the inhabitants have naturally evolved a temperament that is 30% gloom and 70% espresso. The primary requirement for being a grunge poet is to sound as though you are trying to sing while simultaneously being strangled by your own boredom. Cobain was the master of this. He possessed a voice that could transition from a whisper to a scream without the intermediate step of a melody. He sang about teen spirit, which I initially took to be a brand of cheap gin, but later discovered was a reference to a deodorant. There is something profoundly American about the voice of a generation being inspired by a hygiene product. It is the sort of irony I would have paid $1 to invent. The comparison of despair. I couldn't help but compare this 20th century melancholy to the 19th century version I knew so well. Every age requires a poet of despair. It is a fundamental human need, like bread or the urge to lie about the size of a fish you almost caught. The 19th century poet dies of consumption while looking at a portrait of a woman named Lenore. His last words are usually in Latin. The 20th century poet dies of alternative rock while looking at a television set. His last words are usually a complaint about the corporate greed of his record label. The grunge movement was essentially a rebellion against the Gilded Age of the 1980s, that decade of neon lights, hairspray, and people who looked like they were made entirely of plastic and cocaine. Cobain and his ilk were a reaction to the phoniness of it all. They wanted authenticity, which is a word people use when they want to justify wearing clothes that smell like a wet dog. They made a virtue out of apathy. In my time, if you were apathetic, you were generally considered a lazy scoundrel who wouldn't help put out a barn fire. In 1994, if you were apathetic, you were a visionary. You could sell 5 million records by looking like you hadn't brushed your hair since the Reagan administration and singing about how much you hated being famous. The Unplugged Funeral. I watched the MTV Unplugged performance, a televised event where the loud people are asked to be quiet for an hour, and I realized I was watching a funeral rehearsal. Cobain sat there, surrounded by lilies and candles, looking like a ghost even before he had the official paperwork to be one. He sang old folk songs and his own tortured hymns, and for a moment, the irony vanished. It was a reminder that beneath all the flannel and the feedback, there was a genuine human ache. It was the same ache that drove men to the gold fields of California or the dark alleys of London. It is the realization that the world is a cold, confusing place, and that all the progress in the world, all the steamboats, all the telegraphs, all the information superhighways, cannot fix a broken heart or a quieted soul. But being Mark Twain, I cannot help but find the humor in the aftermath. The moment Cobain died, the authenticity he championed was immediately packaged, barcoded, and sold back to the public at a 20% markup. Step 1. A man dies because he hates the commercialization of his soul. Step 2. the world mourns by buying commemorative grunge collections at the local mall. Step 3. Suddenly, every young man in America is wearing a $50 pre-ripped flannel shirt to show how much he doesn't care about money. It is the great American cycle. We turn our rebels into mascots and our tragedies into merchandise. If I had a nickel for every rebel whose image ended up on a coffee mug, I'd have enough money to buy the Mississippi River and turn it into a private swimming pool. The legacy of the X. Cobain's death was the end of a certain kind of innocence for Generation X. They realized that you could be the most famous person on the planet with millions of fans and a direct line to the World Wide Web and still feel like a man lost in a forest with no compass. I reflect on this as I look at the digital world of 1994. We are building these incredible networks to connect everyone to everything. We are launching web crawlers and mosaic browsers so that no thought shall ever be lost. And yet, the most famous poet of the age felt so disconnected that he chose to exit the theater before the second act was even finished. It is a warning to the future. You can have all the information in the universe at your fingertips, but if you don't have a reason to get out of bed, the information is just so much static in the wire. Cobain was a man who had everything the 1990s promised: fame, fortune, and a platform, and found it all to be as empty as a politician's promise. So I tip my spectral hat to the man from Aberdeen. He was a poet of the mud, a singer of the snags, and a reminder that even in an age of digital miracles, the human spirit is still a fragile thing that can be crushed by its own weight. Generation X would go on, of course. They would eventually trade their flannel for fleece vests, start .com companies, and become the very corporate entities they once mocked. But for a few weeks in 1994, the shot heard round the digital world made them stop and think. And then, in true American fashion, they went back to watching the trial of the century and wondering when the new Lion King movie was coming out. Life, as I have often observed, is just one long sequence of people being distracted from their own mortality by shiny objects and loud noises. Kurt Cobain just happened to be the one who turned off the noise and walked out of the room, leaving the rest of us to wonder if we should have been paying closer attention to the lyrics. As for me, I'll stick to my 19th century despair. It's much more polite. It involves significantly more cigars, and I don't have to worry about my unplugged performance being interrupted by a commercial for light beer. But I'll give the grunge boys this: they knew how to make a racket. And in a world that's increasingly full of polite lies, a good, honest racket is sometimes the only thing that feels real. Chapter 5. The Comet's Kiss on Jupiter. I have always found the heavens to be a trifle disorganized. In my day, we looked at the stars and saw a grand shimmering tapestry of silence, a place where nothing ever happened except for the occasional moonrise or the passage of a comet that looked like a celestial paintbrush dipped in silver. We were taught that space was a vast, empty ballroom where the planets waltzed in dignified circles, never stepping on one another's toes and certainly never engaging in a common barroom brawl. But in July of 1994, the universe decided to drop the pretense of dignity. It turns out that the solar system is less like a ballroom and more like a poorly lit billiard hall, where the players are blindfolded and the table is tilted. The culprit was a celestial vagabond by the name of Shoemaker Levy 9. Now, I must pause to remark on the human habit of naming catastrophic cosmic debris as if it were a firm of respectable London solicitors. Shoemaker Levy 9 sounds like the kind of place where you'd go to get your boots repaired or your will contested, not a 21-piece string of apocalyptic ice mountains hurtling through the dark at 37 miles per second. I've seen some fast things in my life. A Mississippi steamboat with a tied-down safety valve, a politician making for a loophole, and a creditor on the scent of a debtor. But 37 miles per second is a speed that defies the imagination. It is a speed that makes fast look like it's standing still and quick look like it's taken a nap. This comet, you see, had been captured by Jupiter some years prior. Jupiter, that great bloated striped gas bag of a planet, is the solar system's neighborhood bully and its greatest benefactor all at once. It has enough gravity to pull the fillings right out of your teeth from 100 million miles away. It took Shoemaker Levy 9, which was originally a single, dignified comet, and tore it into 21 distinct fragments. The astronomers, with their usual flair for the poetic, called it a string of pearls. I call it a celestial freight train that had jumped the tracks and was now headed straight for the biggest house in the neighborhood. Now, in 1894, if a comet had hit Jupiter, we would have known absolutely nothing about it. We would have been sitting on our porches, sipping lemonade and worrying about the price of hogs, blissfully unaware that a planet millions of miles away was being punched in the face by a cosmic fist. But by 1994, the human race had developed a peculiar new hobby: staring. We had the Hubble Space Telescope, which had recently been fitted with a pair of corrective spectacles, at a cost that would have made the king of Siam weep, and every observatory on Earth was pointed toward the king of planets. We were, for the first time in history, invited to watch a celestial execution in real time. It began on July 16th. Fragment A, the lead car of this icy funeral procession, plunged into the thick, swirling atmosphere of Jupiter. And what happened next was enough to make a man reconsider his place in the hierarchy of the universe. You must understand that Jupiter is not made of solid ground. It has no bottom to hit. It is a world of gas and clouds, a place where the storms are larger than the entire Earth and the wind blows with a ferocity that would make a Kansas tornado look like a gentle summer breeze. When that comet hit, it didn't just go thud. It exploded with the force of millions of megatons of dynamite. It created a plume of fire that rose thousands of miles into the sky, a fireball so immense it would have swallowed our entire little world without even pausing to burp. And then came the bruises. As the fragments continued to rain down over the next 6 days, they left behind dark, soot-colored spots in the Jovian clouds. These were not mere puffs of smoke. These were scars, giant black welts on the face of the planet, some of them larger than the diameter of the Earth itself. If you took every person, every city, every mountain, and every ocean on our planet and threw them into one of those black spots, they would have vanished like a pebble in a well. I watched the astronomers on the television, those men and women who spend their lives squinting at dots of light, and for the first time they looked genuinely rattled. They usually talk about the universe with a certain dry academic detachment, as if the stars were merely numbers in a ledger. But as they watched those black spots appear on Jupiter, their eyes went wide and their voices went thin. "It's a violent universe," one of them remarked, with the air of a man who had just discovered that his pet poodle was actually a wolf. I couldn't help but chuckle. Of course it's a violent universe. We live on a tiny, fragile marble in a shooting gallery where the bullets are made of mountain-sized rocks, and the players have no sense of mercy. The comet's kiss was a misnomer of the highest order. It wasn't a kiss, it was a headbutt delivered by a giant. It was a very violent way for the universe to remind us that space is not nearly as empty as it looks. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of all we survey, but 1994 taught us that we are merely microbes living on a dust mote in a room full of swinging hammers. If one of those fragments, even a small one, the size of a Kansas farmhouse, had decided to visit Earth instead of Jupiter, the history of 1994 would have consisted of a single, very short sentence. And then everyone disappeared. But Jupiter, in its role as the solar system's grand striped shield, took the hits for us. It sucked those icy killers into its own gravity well and digested them, leaving nothing but a few dark spots that eventually faded back into the clouds. It was a magnificent display of planetary plumbing. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. While the people of Earth were glued to their screens, watching the destruction of a world they could never visit, they were simultaneously ignoring the destruction they were wreaking on the one they actually inhabited. We are a curious species. We will weep for a gas giant 300 million miles away, but we won't walk 10 feet to pick up a piece of litter or speak a kind word to a neighbor. I mused on the shoemakers and the levee, the people whose names were now forever linked to this cosmic brawl. Imagine having your name attached to a series of explosions that redefine the face of a planet. It's a lot of responsibility. If I were Mr. Levy, I'd be worried about getting a bill from Jupiter for the repairs. 2. David Levy. 4. 12 black eyes and a ruined atmosphere. Total $12 trillion. Please pay by the 1st of the month. But that is the beauty of the 1994 mind. We had reached a point where we could predict the apocalypse, photograph the apocalypse, and then broadcast the apocalypse during the commercial breaks of a sitcom. We had turned the terrifying majesty of the cosmos into must-see TV. As the last fragment, Fragment W, made its final fiery descent, I realized that the spring of the rainbow in South Africa and the comet's kiss on Jupiter were two sides of the same coin. One showed the miraculous possibility of human redemption. The other showed the absolute insignificance of human existence. We are caught between the two, a race of creatures who can build a telescope to watch the stars, but who still can't quite figure out how to share a planet without hitting each other. I puffed on my spectral cigar and watched the Jovian bruises slowly drift and dissolve. It was a grand show, a hilarious piece of cosmic theater that reminded us that the universe doesn't care about our borders, our politics, or our information superhighways. To a comet, we are all just part of the target. As the news cycle moved on to the next scandal, likely involving a lawyer, a glove, or a politician's haircut, I stayed a moment longer, looking up at the real sky. It seemed a bit more crowded than it had before. a bit more dangerous, and a whole lot more interesting. The universe had finally shown its hand, and it turned out the house was playing with a stacked deck and a very heavy pair of boots. 1994 was indeed the year of the spectacle. But while the Bronco was crawling down the highway at 30 miles an hour, the real action was happening at 37 miles a second, way up where the pearls meet the king. I reckon I'll stick to the porch for now. It's safer, the lemonade is cold, and the only things falling from the sky are the occasional raindrops, which, after seeing what Jupiter went through, I am more than happy to tolerate. Chapter 6. The Navigation of the Netscape. I have always been a man who appreciates a good title. A well-chosen name can sell a mediocre cigar, elect a scoundrel to the Senate, or convince a man that a swamp in Florida is actually a retirement paradise. So, when I first heard the words Netscape Navigator echoing through the digital corridors of 1994, I sat up and took notice. It is a grand, sweeping name. It suggests a man in a tri-cornered hat standing on the prow of a galleon, squinting through a brass telescope at the edge of the world. It suggests adventure, salt spray, and the discovery of spice islands. In reality, however, a navigator in 1994 was a person sitting in a swivel chair staring at a gray box until their eyes turned the color of a boiled turnip, waiting for a picture of a cat to materialize one agonizing pixel at a time. This was the year the World Wide Web decided to stop being a secret club for physicists with unkempt hair and start being a public playground for the rest of humanity. And the gatekeeper to this playground was a piece of software created by a young man named Mark Andreessen, who, from what I can gather, possessed the audacity of a Mississippi gambler and the hairline of a man 20 years his senior. The Pilot and the Mouse. As a former cub pilot on the Mississippi, I feel I have a certain authority on the subject of navigation. To navigate a river is an art form. You must know the shape of the shore, the depth of the channel, the location of every sunken log, and the temper of the water on a moonless night. It requires a brain like a library and a stomach like a cast-iron stove. But navigating the Netscape, that required nothing more than a steady index finger and a bottomless well of patience. In the digital realm, navigation consists of clicking on a piece of blue text called a hyperlink. I find the term hyperlink suspicious. It sounds like a nervous affliction or a brand of very fast sausages. You click the link and, provided the ghosts in the machine are feeling cooperative, you are whisked away to another page. It is a miracle of sorts, I suppose, but it is a miracle that has robbed the human race of the joy of getting lost. When I traveled, I got lost in the woods, in the mountains, and occasionally in the middle of a sentence. Getting lost is how you learn things. But with a navigator at your elbow, you are never lost. You are simply loading. The great loading bar of despair. Let us speak for a moment about the loading bar. This is a little horizontal strip that slowly fills with color to show you how much of the information has traveled through the wires into your brain. I have watched many things in my life. I have watched paint dry. I have watched a legislature debate a tax on dogs, and I have watched a glacier move toward the sea, but none of them can match the exquisite, soul-crushing boredom of a 1994 loading bar. It moves in fits and starts. It will race to 50% with the confidence of a thoroughbred, and then it will stop. It will sit there, mocking you for 3 minutes, while the internal machinery of your computer makes a sound like a coffee grinder full of gravel. You sit, you wait, you contemplate your sins, and eventually the bar completes its journey and you are rewarded with a block of text and a grainy photograph of a man in Switzerland. We are told that this is the information age, but it feels more like the waiting for information age. We have built a superhighway, but we're all driving wagons with square wheels. The web and the spiders. I am also struck by the choice of the word web. Now, who in their right mind wants to be in a web? In nature, a web is a trap. It is a sticky, intricate construction designed by a predatory insect to catch flies and turn them into lunch. By calling this new frontier the World Wide Web, the inventors were remarkably honest. They were building a giant global trap, and we were all fluttering into it with our wings buzzing and our eyes wide with wonder. We thought we were the explorers, but I suspect we were the flies. And the spiders? Well, the spiders were the young men in Silicon Valley who realized that if you can get the whole world to sit in your web, you can charge them a nickel every time they twitch. The Browser Wars. 1994 also saw the beginning of what the papers called the Browser Wars. It was Netscape versus Mosaic, and later the great behemoth Microsoft would join the fray with something called Internet Explorer, a name that suggests a man in a pith helmet wandering through a jungle, though in practice it was more like a man in a cubicle wandering through a spreadsheet. I find the idea of a war between pieces of invisible code to be highly entertaining. In my day, a war involved cannons, cavalry, and a great deal of mud. In 1994, a war involved market share, IPOs, and young men in polo shirts insulting each other's algorithms. It was a race to the bottom of the human attention span. The goal was to make the browser so easy to use that even a person with the intellectual capacity of a garden gnome could find their way around. They added buttons, a home button, as if the machine were a faithful dog that would lead you back to your porch. A back button, allowing you to undo your mistakes, a luxury that life, alas, does not afford. The competition was fierce. Everyone was trying to get to the destination first, regardless of how much coal they had to burn or how many people they left in their wake. They were innovating, which is a modern word for adding features that nobody asked for and that make the whole thing break more often. The death of the physical. As I watched the rise of Netscape, I felt a twinge of sadness for the physical world. We were beginning to trade the solid for the ethereal. In my time, if you wanted to see the world, you had to pack a trunk, endure the smell of a crowded stagecoach, and risk catching a tropical fever. It was a miserable, glorious business, but the navigator promised that you could see the world from your parlor. You could visit the Louvre, read a newspaper from London, or see a map of Tokyo, all without leaving your slippers. But what do you lose in the exchange? You lose the smell of the sea, the taste of foreign bread, and the sound of a language you don't understand being shouted by a man who's trying to sell you a rug. You lose the texture of life. A picture of the Louvre on a screen is not the Louvre. It is merely a ghost of the Louvre, trapped in a box. The digital river. I suppose I shouldn't be too hard on the boys at Netscape. They were pioneers in their own way. They were charting a new kind of river, a digital Mississippi that flows not with water, but with bits and bytes. But I worry about the pilots of this new river. On the real Mississippi, if a pilot made a mistake, he ran his boat aground and perhaps lost a few crates of molasses. On the digital river, if a pilot makes a mistake, he might accidentally delete the collective memory of the human race, or, worse yet, unleash a plague of electronic mail that will haunt us until the end of time. Netscape Navigator was the first real steering wheel for the masses. It gave every man, woman, and child the ability to point their ship toward the horizon and click. It was the beginning of a grand, chaotic, and utterly hilarious experiment in human connection. I sat back in my spectral chair and watched the N logo pulse on millions of screens. It was a blue steering wheel beckoning the world to come and play. I wondered where it would take us. Would it lead us to a new enlightenment? Or would it just lead us to a place where we all sit in separate rooms, staring at separate boxes, navigating toward a destination that doesn't actually exist? Only time will tell. But for now, in 1994, the Navigator is king. The loading bars are slow, the hyperlinks are blue, and the world is slowly becoming a web. I reckon I'll just stick to my old maps and my memories. They don't require loading, and they never, ever crash when you're right in the middle of a good story. Still, you have to admire the ambition. To take the entire world and put it inside a gray window, that's a humbug of truly biblical proportions. I wish I'd thought of it myself. I'd have called it TwAIn's Traveling Telegraph and charged $1 a click. I'd be richer than Vanderbilt by Tuesday. Chapter 7. The Channel's Grand Opening. Man is a burrowing animal. I have long suspected that we are simply large, exceedingly vain prairie dogs with a penchant for waistcoats and complicated legal systems. From the moment we are born, we seem possessed by an irresistible urge to dig. We dig for gold. We dig for coal. We dig for hidden truths that are usually better left buried, and eventually we dig a hole to lie down in for the long sleep. But in May of 1994, the human race reached the pinnacle of its excavatory ambition. The English and the French, two nations that have spent the better part of a millennium trying to push each other off the map, decided to meet in the middle, specifically underneath 40 fathoms of seawater and several million tons of mud. They called it the Channel Tunnel, or the Chunnel, a word that sounds remarkably like a digestive ailment or a brand of inexpensive industrial soap. Now, I have crossed the English Channel in my time. It is a wretched strip of water. It is 21 miles of temperamental gray slop that exists for the sole purpose of turning a man's stomach into a centrifuge. I have stood on the deck of a steamer, clutching the rail with the desperation of a man seeking a loan from a brother-in-law, and wondered why a benevolent providence would put two such interesting countries so close together and then separate them with a liquid trampoline. For centuries, the English and the French viewed that water as a blessing. To the English, it was a moat defensive, a salty barrier that kept the French from arriving uninvited and demanding that everyone start eating snails and using more vowels. To the French, it was a convenient buffer that kept the English at a distance, where their lack of culinary imagination couldn't do any real damage. But in 1994, they decided the moat was out of fashion. They spent billions of pounds, and I assume a similar number of francs, though I can never quite keep track of the exchange rate once the decimals start flying, to dig a hole from Folkestone to Coquelles. The meeting in the mud. The engineering of the thing was a spectacle of the highest order. They started digging from both sides like two neighbors trying to build a shared root cellar without actually speaking to one another. I find the logistics of this terrifying. If I were in charge of such a project, I can guarantee that we would have missed. We would have ended up with two very expensive, very damp, dead ends. Or perhaps we would have accidentally emerged in the middle of a Belgian potato field, but these modern engineers possess a frightening level of precision. They met in the middle with an error of only a few inches. When the final wall of chalk was breached, a Frenchman and an Englishman shook hands through the hole. I reckon it was the first time in history a Frenchman and an Englishman have met in the dark, without one of them trying to stab the other with a bayonet. It was a victory for mathematics, though a bit of a blow to the tradition of international hostility. The Royal and the Republican. The grand opening involved Queen Elizabeth II and President François Mitterrand. It was a study in contrasts. You had the British monarchy, which is essentially a very old, very expensive firm that specializes in waving and wearing hats, meeting the French Republic, which is a collection of people who believe that authority is something that should be challenged daily over a glass of red wine. They took the train, the Eurostar, which is a sleek, white mechanical serpent that can travel at speeds that would make a lightning bolt look like it was dragging its feet. They met at the halfway point, and the Queen, with her steadfast handbag and her aura of "we are not amused," shook hands with Mitterrand, who looked as though he were contemplating the philosophical implications of being in a tube under the ocean. I watched this from my celestial armchair and marveled. Man has finally conquered the sea, not by sailing over it, but by crawling under it like a common worm. It is a grand achievement, certainly, but it robs travel of its poetry. Where is the drama? Where is the risk of being boarded by pirates? Where is the opportunity to lean over the rail and contribute your lunch to the Atlantic? Now, you just sit in a comfortable seat, read a newspaper, and 20 minutes later, the signs have changed from toilets to toilettes. It's too efficient. It's too tidy. It's the sort of progress that makes the world feel smaller and, consequently, a bit more crowded. The psychology of the tunnel. I suspect that the tunnel is more than just a railroad. It is a psychological experiment. By connecting the island of Britain to the continent of Europe, they have essentially told the English that they are no longer an island. This is a hard pill for an Englishman to swallow. An Englishman's sense of identity is tied to the fact that there is a wall of water between him and the rest of the world. It's what allows him to be eccentric instead of just strange. And the French? They now have to deal with the fact that the English can arrive in Paris in under 3 hours. That's barely enough time to prepare a proper defense, let alone a decent sauce. The tunnel is a burrowing instinct realized on a grand scale, but it also reflects our modern obsession with the shortcut. We are a race that hates the long way around. We hate the waiting. We hate the weather. And we hate the uncertainty of the journey. We want to be there, and we want to be there now. If we could dig a tunnel through the center of the earth to get to China 5 minutes faster, we'd do it, regardless of the fact that we'd likely be incinerated by the core. We'd just invent a refrigerated suit and sell advertising space on the sleeves. The ghost in the tube. I imagine a steam-powered ghost, perhaps the shade of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, taking the train through the channel. He would be baffled. He would look for the soot, the grease, and the thunderous roar of the engine, and find only the hum of electricity and the quiet rustle of a businessman's briefcase. "Where is the struggle?" he would ask. "Where is the sweat?" And the 1994 traveler would look up from his digital watch and say, "The struggle is that the coffee in the buffet car is lukewarm, and my mobile telephone doesn't work under the seabed." We have traded the grand struggles of the past for the petty inconveniences of the present. We have built a miracle of engineering so that we can complain about the price of a ham sandwich while traveling through a mountain of mud. The end of distance. As the channel opened for business, I realized that the map of the world was being redrawn, not by war, but by the shovel. 1994 was the year the English Channel became the English Ditch. It is a funny thing, really. We spend centuries fighting over borders, and then we spend billions to make those borders irrelevant. We build walls, and then we dig tunnels under them. It's as if we can't decide whether we want to be alone or together. So we settle for a compromise. We'll stay in our own countries, but we'll make it as easy as possible to leave them. I'll give the English and the French this much. They've managed to create a masterpiece of human ingenuity. They've proven that if you throw enough money and enough math at a problem, you can overcome even the most stubborn of seas. But as for me, I think I'll stick to the memory of the steamer. I like the wind in my face, the salt on my lips, and the honest, old-fashioned terror of a wave that looks like a house. A tunnel is for moles and politicians. A man of the river deserves a bit of horizon. Still, the next time I'm in a hurry to get from London to Paris, which, given my current state of existence, is unlikely to be an issue, I might consider the channel, if only to see if the French have finally learned how to make a decent cup of tea, now that the English are so much closer. But I won't hold my breath. After all, 21 miles of mud is a lot to overcome, but 1,000 years of history is a whole lot thicker. 1994? What a year! We're digging under the sea, watching comets hit Jupiter, and following white trucks down highways. I reckon the only thing left for us to do is find a way to make the internet smell like old books. But I'm told Mr. Bezos is still working on that in his garage. I'll keep my eyes open, or whatever it is I do now. The world is getting faster, the tunnels are getting longer, and I'm just trying to keep my cigar lit in the draft. Chapter 8. The Gump Philosophy. In the summer of 1994, the American public, having already exhausted itself watching a slow-speed truck chase and celebrating the end of a 300-year-old feud in a damp tunnel, decided to collectively lose its mind over a fellow who sat on a park bench and talked to strangers until they likely wished for a sudden, merciful cloudburst. The moving picture was called Forrest Gump. I have seen many heroes in my time, men who led charges at Gettysburg, men who piloted steamboats through fog as thick as wool, and men who managed to stay sober through an entire session of the Nevada legislature. But this Mr. Gump was something new. He was a man of limited intellectual capital who managed to accrue a fortune in historical experiences simply by being too polite to leave the room when history started happening. The Great Chocolate Fallacy. The film begins with a feather drifting through the air, a metaphor for a life without a rudder, and settles on our hero, who utters a phrase that has since been plastered onto every cross-stitched pillow and commemorative tin in the Republic. My mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. Now, as a man who has spent a significant portion of his life dealing with the vagaries of fortune, I must take issue with this. If you buy a box of chocolates, there is usually a very helpful map on the inside of the lid. If you end up with the one filled with the medicinal cherry paste or that grit-textured orange foam, it is because you were either too lazy to read the chart or too reckless to care. However, the American public devoured this sentiment as if it were a new gospel. They found comfort in the idea that life is just a series of sugary accidents. To my mind, life is less like a box of chocolates and more like a game of poker played in a dark room with a dealer who is known to be a scoundrel. You might get a flush, or you might get a thumb in your eye, but you can usually bet that the house isn't looking to give away the sweets for free. The luck of the simpleton. What fascinated me most about Mr. Gump was his uncanny ability to stumble into greatness without the burden of intention. He becomes a college football star because he doesn't know when to stop running. He becomes a war hero because he is too fond of his friends to notice the bullets. He becomes a billionaire in the shrimping business because a hurricane decides to sink every boat in the harbor except his. I've known Mississippi gamblers who would have traded their own mothers for a tenth of Gump's luck. I've seen men spend 40 years studying the currents of the river, the shifts in the wind, and the psychology of the market, only to end up bankrupt and living in a tent. And here comes Forrest, a man who couldn't find his own hat in a one-room house if it wasn't strapped to his chin, and he ends up teaching Elvis how to dance and exposing the Watergate scandal because he was looking for a bathroom. It is a peculiarly American myth, the idea that brilliance is a handicap and that a lack of imagination is the surest path to the top. We love the everyman, but in 1994, we fell in love with the no man, a blank slate upon which we could project all our national nostalgia. Digital resurrection and ghostly cameos. The makers of this film used a new kind of digital sorcery to insert Mr. Gump into actual historical footage. He shakes hands with John F. Kennedy. He sits on a sofa with John Lennon. He shows Lyndon B. Johnson his war wound, which, in a display of true Gumpian elegance, is located on his posterior. From my perspective in the afterlife, I found this deeply unsettling. It's bad enough being a ghost without having to worry about some Hollywood technician editing you into a commercial for laundry soap or a meeting of the Temperance Union. If they can make a fictional simpleton talk to a dead president, then the past is no longer a fixed record. It is a piece of clay that can be reshaped to suit the whims of the present. I began to worry that if I wasn't careful, I'd look up and see myself in a sequel, perhaps teaching Forrest how to smoke a cigar or helping him write a book about a boy on a raft. I can tell you now, if Mr. Gump had been on that raft with Huck and Jim, the book would have been much shorter, as he likely would have accidentally paddled them straight to Ohio in the first 3 chapters while trying to catch a butterfly. the shrimp, and the apple. In the latter half of the story, Forrest's friend, the irascible Lieutenant Dan, a man whose primary contribution to the plot is to be angry at God for not letting him die in a jungle, invests their shrimping profits in some kind of fruit company. The company, as it turns out, was Apple Computer. In 1994, this joke brought the house down. The audience roared with laughter at the idea of a simpleton owning a piece of a computer company. But sitting there, in the glow of the future, I realized the joke was on the audience. While they were laughing at Forrest's accidental investment, the world was being quietly conquered by those very same fruit people. Within a few years, everyone in that theater would be carrying a glowing piece of that fruit in their pocket, using it to navigate the Netscape and order books from Mr. Bezos's garage. It turns out that Forrest Gump wasn't just lucky. He was the ultimate early adopter. He bought the future while the rest of us were still trying to figure out how to program our VCRs. The philosophy of the bench. Why did this movie strike such a chord in 1994? I reckon it's because the world was getting too complicated. We had the internet, we had the channel, we had the information superhighway, and we had the terrifying reality of Rwanda. Everything was moving at the speed of a comet hitting Jupiter, and here was Forrest, telling us that it's okay not to understand, telling us that if you just stay polite, keep running, and listen to your mama, everything will turn out all right. It was a 2-hour vacation from the intellect. It was a warm blanket for a nation that was starting to feel the cold draft of the coming millennium. But I must offer a word of caution. The Gump philosophy is a dangerous thing if taken in large doses. If everyone sat on a bench and waited for a feather to tell them what to do, the world would grind to a halt. We need the dreamers, the schemers, and even the rascals to keep the gears turning. A world of Gumps is a world without progress, without satire, and certainly without a decent game of poker. As the film ended and the feather took flight once more, I found myself feeling a strange sort of envy. Not for Forrest's money, or his medals, or his shrimp. I envied his peace of mind. To walk through the 20th century, the bloodiest, loudest, most chaotic century in human history, and come out the other side with nothing but a fond memory of a girl and a good recipe for fried shrimp is a feat more miraculous than walking on water. But then I remembered that I am Mark Twain. I am not meant for peace of mind. I am meant for the struggle, the wit, and the glorious, messy business of trying to make sense of the nonsense. I'll leave the park bench to Forrest. I'd rather be on the deck of a boat, watching the snags and the sandbars, knowing exactly what I'm getting, because I took the trouble to look at the map. 1994 was a box of chocolates, all right. Some of it was sweet, some of it was nuts, and a good portion of it was that pink coconut paste that makes you want to gargle with bourbon. But we ate the whole box anyway, and then we asked for seconds. Next time, I think I'll just stick to the cigars. You always know what's in a cigar: tobacco, fire, and the silent promise of a good conversation. You don't need a feather to find your way to a smoke. Chapter 9. The Soccer Frontier. In the sweltering heat of July 1994, the United States of America, a nation that prides itself on inventing games where men wear enough armor to invade a small European principality or swing wooden clubs at small white balls with the fury of a man swatting a hornet, decided to host the FIFA World Cup. This is a tournament dedicated to a sport the rest of the world calls football, but which Americans, with their characteristic gift for linguistic unnecessariness, have dubbed soccer. I have spent a lifetime observing the American character, and if there is one thing we cannot abide, it is a mystery that doesn't involve a crime. And to the average American in 1994, soccer was the greatest mystery since the disappearance of the honest politician. The great digital hands-off policy. The fundamental premise of soccer is that you must move a ball from one end of a pasture to the other, using every part of your anatomy except the two things that distinguish us from the lower primates, our hands. Now, I ask you, what kind of a game forbids a man from using his thumbs? God gave us thumbs so that we might hold a pen, shuffle a deck of cards, and pull a trigger. To tell an American he must spend 90 minutes in a stadium and never once touch the ball with his hands is like telling a preacher he can go to the pulpit, but he isn't allowed to use any adjectives. It is a cruel and unusual restriction that borders on the unconstitutional. I watched these athletes, men of remarkable cardiovascular stamina who appeared to have been carved out of teak wood, run back and forth across the grass for hours. They chased a ball with the frantic devotion of a dog chasing a carriage, and yet, whenever they got close to the goal, they were expected to perform a feat of acrobatic footwork that would have baffled a ballet master. Soccer is a game where 22 men spend 2 hours trying to avoid using their hands, only to end the afternoon with a score of 0-0, a result that in any other American endeavor would be considered a failed business meeting. The Diana Ross catastrophe. The tournament began in Chicago with an opening ceremony that was meant to showcase American grandeur, but ended up showcasing the American genius for the glorious misfire. The legendary singer Diana Ross was tasked with running across the field and kicking a ball into a goal from a distance of approximately 6 feet. It was a feat that even a man in a deep coma could likely have accomplished by simply falling in the right direction. Ms. Ross ran. She swung her leg with the grace of a gazelle, and she missed the entire goal by a margin that can only be described as theatrical. To make matters worse, the goalposts were rigged with a small explosive charge meant to collapse them, as if the power of her kick had shattered the very foundations of the sport. Despite the ball being halfway to the sidelines, the goal dutifully collapsed anyway. It was a perfect metaphor for the American relationship with soccer in 1994. We didn't know where the goal was. We missed the ball entirely, but we still insisted on the fireworks and the collapse of the scenery. The agony of the 0-0 draw. The greatest hurdle for the American mind, however, was the draw. In America, we do not believe in the draw. We believe that at the end of a contest, one man should be standing on a pedestal and the other should be in the dirt, contemplating his failures. I sat in the spectral bleachers and watched a match between two nations whose names I could barely pronounce. And after 90 minutes of heroic exertion, the score was 0-0. The whistle blew, and the players began hugging each other, after 2 hours of doing absolutely nothing to the scoreboard. The Americans in the stands looked around with the expression of people who had been promised a riot and were instead given a lecture on the history of the turnip. They had paid $50 for a ticket, $20 for a hot dog that tasted like a boiled glove, and $10 for a foam finger that they weren't even allowed to use to point at the ball. And nobody won. "Where is the climax?" a man next to me shouted at his television. "Where is the points? Why hasn't anybody been tackled into the next zip code?" I felt for him. To the American soul, a scoreless tie is a form of spiritual purgatory. It is a story with no ending, a joke with no punchline, a river that flows into a swamp and just stays there. We are a nation that demands a final score that looks like a telephone number. If the score isn't 42-38, we feel as though we've been swindled by the management. The Brazilian ballet and the Italian heartbreak. As the tournament progressed toward the final at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, the quality of the beautiful game began to win over even the most skeptical of observers. The Brazilians played with a joy that suggested the ball was an old friend they were merely inviting for a walk. They danced. They spun. They made the ball do things that violated the laws of physics and several local ordinances. On the other side was Italy, led by a man named Roberto Baggio, the divine ponytail. Now, I have seen many hairstyles in my time. I once saw a senator whose hair looked like a nesting site for a particularly depressed eagle, but Baggio's ponytail was a work of art. It trailed behind him like the tail of a comet as he carved his way through defenses. The final match, however, was the ultimate test of American patience. It stayed at 0-0 through the regular time. It stayed at 0-0 through extra time. It was as if the two teams had entered a pact to see how long they could keep the American public from watching their evening news. Eventually, they reached the penalty shootout. This is a barbaric ritual where, after 2 hours of teamwork, they pick 5 men and ask them to perform a task that will either make them national heroes or force them to live in a cave for the next 20 years. Baggio, the hero, the poet, the man with the ponytail, stepped up for the final kick. The world held its breath. I held my spectral cigar. He kicked the ball, and it didn't go into the net. It sailed high over the crossbar, headed toward the celestial realm where I reside. It was a kick that broke 1,000,000 Italian hearts and sent the Brazilians into a frenzy of samba and celebration. The soccer frontier conquered. By the end of that summer, the United States had achieved something remarkable. We had hosted the most successful World Cup in history, despite the fact that half the people in the stadium still thought a corner kick was something you did to a malfunctioning vending machine. We had learned that soccer is not about the score. It is about the anticipation of the score. It is a game of tension, of near misses, and of a collective yearning that builds until it becomes almost unbearable. It is the only sport where a man can become a legend by failing at the last possible second. I realized then that soccer is the perfect sport for the information age. It is global, it is relentless, and it requires no translation. You don't need to know the language to understand the agony of a missed goal or the ecstasy of a last-minute save. But I still reckon the game would be improved by the addition of a few more points and perhaps a rule that allows a man to use his hands if he's feeling particularly frustrated. After all, if God didn't want us to use our hands to move things, He wouldn't have given us the ability to point at the referee and tell him exactly what we think of his eyesight. As the crowds left the Rose Bowl and the soccer frontier was officially settled, I looked out over the empty field and thought of all those Americans who had spent the summer trying to understand the world's game. They hadn't quite mastered it, but they had participated in the spectacle. And in 1994, as we've seen, the spectacle is all that matters. I'll stick to baseball myself. It's a slower game, it involves more sitting down, and you're allowed to use a wooden stick to hit things. It's much more in keeping with my temperament, but I'll give the soccer boys credit. They can run. I haven't seen that much running since the last time a bill collector visited my house in Hartford. 1994, a year of miracles indeed. We survived the Bronco, we survived the Comet, and we survived a month of men in shorts not using their hands. I can only imagine what 1995 has in store. Probably a game where you aren't allowed to use your feet either, and everyone just glares at the ball until it moves out of sheer embarrassment. I'll keep my eyes peeled, or whatever it is I do now. Chapter 10. The Yahoo Directory. I have always harbored a secret, sneaking admiration for the man who attempts the impossible, primarily because it spares me the trouble of trying it myself. In my time, the impossible usually involved something tangible, like trying to find a silent woman in a jewelry shop or attempting to convince a Missouri mule that a fence was merely a suggestion. But as 1994 progressed, the impossible took on a digital shape. The World Wide Web, which I previously described as a sticky trap for the unwary, had become so cluttered, so disorganized, and so thoroughly infested with information that a man had a better chance of finding a specific needle in a haystack than he did of finding a specific home page in the ether. It was a wilderness of wires. It was a library where the books had no covers, the pages were shuffled like a deck of cards at a riverboat casino, and the librarian had gone fishing in a different dimension. And then along came two young scholars from Stanford University, Jerry Yang and David Philo, who decided that what the wind really needed was a good, sturdy picket fence. The Stanford cartographers. These two gentlemen started a project they originally titled Jerry and David's Guide to the World Wide Web. I must say, the youth of 1994 possessed a remarkable lack of ego when it came to naming their empires. Imagine if I had titled my greatest work, Samuel and Orion's Guide to a Boy on a Raft. It lacks a certain gravitas. However, they eventually settled on a name that was much more in keeping with the spirit of the age. Yahoo! Now, as a man who has spent a fair amount of time in the company of Jonathan Swift, or at least his ghost, I was immediately suspicious. In Gulliver's Travels, a Yahoo is a filthy, irrational creature that represents the worst of human nature. To name the gateway to all human knowledge after a pack of screeching, unwashed savages is either a stroke of self-deprecating genius or a very honest warning about what you're likely to find once you start clicking on things. The at the end of the name is particularly telling. It suggests a level of excitement that I haven't felt since the last time I successfully avoided a debt collector. It's a shout into the void. Yahoo! I found a picture of a cat in Switzerland. Yahoo! I found a list of every flavor of jam available in the United Kingdom. The Yellow Pages for the Infinite. The premise of Yahoo was simple yet gargantuan in its vanity. Jerry and David decided they would manually catalog the entire Internet. They sat in their trailers, another sacred site of Silicon Valley apparently, and spent their days clicking on every new link that appeared and assigning it to a category. I call it the Yellow Pages for the Infinite. In my day, the Yellow Pages was a thick, heavy book that you used to find a plumber or a man who sold reasonably honest horses. It was organized, it was alphabetical, it made sense. But trying to organize the Internet in 1994 was like trying to catalog every wave in the Atlantic Ocean. By the time you've written down wave number 4802, whitecap, slightly salty, 3,000 more waves have crashed onto the shore and your ink is dry. And yet, these boys persisted. They created folders. They had a folder for entertainment, a folder for science, and likely a folder for people who have too much time on their hands and want to tell the world about their collection of antique buttons. It was an attempt to impose the Victorian sense of order onto a digital anarchy. We Victorians loved a good classification. We wanted to pin the world to a board like a butterfly and label it. But the Internet is not a butterfly. It is a swarm of locusts. You can pin one down, but the other 10 million are currently eating your crops and laughing at your pins. The fence around the wind. I watched from my spectral perch as Yahoo grew from a hobby into a portal. This is another 1994 word that I find fascinating. A portal suggests a magical doorway, like the ones in those stories about children hiding in wardrobes. But a digital portal is simply a page that tells you where to go, so you don't have to think for yourself. It was the ultimate fence around the wind. Man has always been terrified of the vast, the unmapped, and the chaotic. We want a guide. We want a map. We want someone to tell us that the good stuff is over here and the weird stuff is over there. But the tragedy of the Yahoo directory was that it was built by humans. And humans, as I have frequently noted, are flawed, biased, and occasionally prone to being distracted by shiny objects. If Jerry or David liked a particular site about prose poetry and saltwater toffee, it would be placed in a prominent position. If they didn't, it might as well have been buried in the comet bruises on Jupiter. It was the birth of the gatekeeper. We had escaped the tyranny of the traditional publishers and the television networks, only to hand the keys of the kingdom to two students in a trailer who were deciding what was cool and what was uncool. The humbug of the cool. In 1994, cool became the primary currency of the digital realm. Yahoo had a section called What's Cool, which was essentially a list of things that Jerry and David found interesting while they were eating cold pizza at 3 in the morning. I checked the What's Cool list once. It was a collection of websites that featured things like the coffee pot cam, a camera pointed at a coffee pot in a laboratory in Cambridge so that people all over the world could see if there was any coffee left. 95 million people watched a white Bronco drive slowly down a highway, and thousands more spent their afternoons watching a coffee pot in England. I tell you, if I had known that the future of human curiosity would be centered on the contents of a carafe, I would have spent much more time writing about kitchen appliances and much less time worrying about the moral decay of the Mississippi. It was a grand humbug. We were told that we were exploring the frontier, but we were actually just wandering around a very large, very cluttered shopping mall, where the signs were being rewritten every 5 minutes by people who hadn't slept since the previous Tuesday. The paradox of choice. The more Yahoo organized the web, the more paralyzed the public became. This is a phenomenon I call the restaurant menu malady. If a menu has 3 items, beef, chicken, or mystery stew, a man can make a decision in 10 seconds and get on with his life. But if a menu has 10,000 items, all categorized by region, spice level, and the mood of the chef, that same man will sit there until he starves to death, unable to choose between the Szechuan duck and the artisanal toast. Yahoo gave the world 10,000 choices for every possible subject. Want to read about history? Here are 400 sites, 3 of which are accurate, 10 of which are written by lunatics, and the rest of which are currently under construction. That under construction sign, a little yellow man with a shovel, was the most common sight on the 1994 web. It was the digital equivalent of a shopkeeper saying, "I've got the doors open, but I haven't actually bought any furniture or stock yet. Feel free to stare at the bare walls." The legacy of the shout. Despite my skepticism, I have to admit that Yahoo was a necessary folly. Without it, the World Wide Web would have remained a dark forest. It gave the common man a lantern, even if the lantern only pointed in the directions that Jerry and David approved of. It also marked the moment when the Internet stopped being a tool and started being a destination. People would go to Yahoo, not to find something specific, but just to see what was there. It was the digital version of a Sunday stroll through the park. You weren't going anywhere. You were just looking at the other strollers and the occasional cool coffee pot. But I still wonder, will man ever stop trying to put a fence around the wind? Will we ever be content to just let the information flow, to get lost, to find things by accident instead of by category? I suspect not. We are a species that loves a list. We love a directory. We love to think that the infinite can be contained in a series of folders, and as Yahoo became a multi-billion-dollar empire, it proved that the most valuable thing you can sell a human being is not information, but directions. I'll stay here in my spectral library, where the only categories are books I've read, books I intend to write, and books that are too boring to exist. I don't need a portal. I don't need an algorithm, and I certainly don't need an exclamation point to tell me when I've found something interesting, but for the boys at Stanford, I tip my hat. They took the chaos of the universe and tried to give it a table of contents. It was a brave, hilarious, and ultimately doomed effort, for the wind will always find a way to blow the fence down. But for one shining moment in 1994, we all believed that if we just clicked on the right folder, we could understand everything. Yahoo! Indeed. I'm just glad they didn't name it after me. TwAIn, the directory of everything, has a nice ring to it, but I'd hate to be responsible for the what's cool list. I'd just put cigars and silence at the top and leave the rest of the page blank. Chapter 11. The North Ridge Shakedown. I have always harbored a deep-seated suspicion of any piece of real estate that refuses to stay where you put it. In my younger days, during my sojourn in the territories of the West, I learned that the earth is not the solid, dependable matron she pretends to be in the geography books. No, sir. She is more like a temperamental stage actress who, having been ignored by the audience for too long, decides to throw a fit and bring the entire theater down around everyone's ears just to remind them who the real star of the show is. In January of 1994, specifically on the 17th day, a day meant for the quiet contemplation of civil rights and the drinking of lukewarm coffee, the city of Los Angeles received a very rude awakening. At 4:31 in the morning, while the aspiring starlets and the billionaire producers were busy dreaming of their next sequels, the Earth decided to perform a shakedown. Now, in the parlance of a Mississippi gambler, a shakedown usually involves a heavyset gentleman named Knuckles, inquiring about the location of your wallet. But a geological shakedown is a much more egalitarian affair. It doesn't care if you're a pauper living in a tent or a tycoon living in a mansion that costs more than the state of Rhode Island. When the Northridge Fault decides to move, everyone pays the same price in broken china and frayed nerves. The California credo, living on the edge of a crack. I have spent a great deal of time pondering the California dream. It is a peculiar psychological malady where thousands of people move to a desert by the sea, plant palm trees that don't belong there, build swimming pools on top of unstable hillsides, and then act surprised when the scenery occasionally tries to murder them. California is a place where people spend their lives looking for the big break, seemingly unaware that the big break is currently located directly beneath their slippers and is moving at the rate of 2 inches a year. The Northridge earthquake was a magnitude 6.7. To the uninitiated, that sounds like a respectable score in a gymnastics competition. But in the language of the Richter scale, a system designed to measure the Earth's digestive upsets, it is the equivalent of taking the entire city of Los Angeles and putting it inside a giant paint can shaker for 20 seconds. 20 seconds. It sounds like a trifle. You can't even boil an egg in 20 seconds. You can barely find your spectacles in 20 seconds. But when the ground beneath you is bucking like a mule with a hornet in its ear, 20 seconds is long enough to meet your maker, negotiate a settlement, and realize you forgot to pay your life insurance premium. The tectonic divorce. What fascinated me most from my spectral vantage point was the sheer indifference of nature toward human property lines. We humans love a fence. We love a surveyor's map. We love to say, this dirt is mine and that dirt is yours. But the Pacific and North American plates have been trying to get a divorce for millions of years, and they don't give a tinker's damn about who owns the mortgage on a 2-bedroom bungalow in the valley. When the Northridge shakedown hit, the earth didn't just shake, it lifted. It was as if the ground had decided it was tired of being stepped on and wanted to see what the sky looked like. Mountains were raised by several inches in a matter of seconds. I've seen men try to move mountains with shovels, with dynamite, and with very expensive legal injunctions. But I've never seen it done with such effortless, terrifying grace as I did that morning in Northridge. The Santa Monica Freeway, the busiest artery in the great, idling heart of Los Angeles, simply gave up the ghost. It collapsed with the weary sigh of an overworked horse. It was a sight that would have made a riverboat pilot weep. A perfectly good thoroughfare suddenly transformed into a series of jagged, impassable islands. For the first time in history, the people of Los Angeles were forced to do something they find more painful than death itself. They had to stay home. The great leveler of vanity. There is something inherently hilarious about the way an earthquake treats vanity. I watched as the most beautiful people in the world scrambled out of their houses in the pre-dawn darkness. There were no makeup artists present. There were no lighting directors. There were only thousands of people in mismatched pajamas, clutching their terrified chihuahuas, and wondering if the apocalypse had finally arrived and if it would be televised on a major network. I saw a man who owned 3 Ferraris standing in his driveway, weeping over a broken jar of imported olives. I saw a woman who had spent a fortune on age-defying treatments suddenly looking very aged indeed as she realized her earthquake kit consisted of a bottle of expensive champagne and a single lonely cracker. It is in these moments that the human race is at its most honest. When the ground is moving, the humbug of civilization falls away. You realize that your car, your house, and your collection of cool websites are all just borrowed finery. The earth is the landlord, and every once in a while she likes to come by and kick the furniture just to see if we're still paying attention. The aftermath, hysteria and bottled water. The weeks following the shakedown were a masterclass in American ingenuity and paranoia. Suddenly, every citizen became an amateur geologist. They talked about aftershocks, with the weary expertise of men who had personally invented the tectonic plate. "Did you feel that one?" they would ask, referring to a tremor that was barely strong enough to rattle a teacup. "Oh, that was just a 3-pointer," the neighbor would reply, acting as though he could distinguish between a 3.2 and a 3.4 by the way his knees vibrated. The sale of bottled water reached levels that suggested the Pacific Ocean had suddenly turned to dust. People bought enough flashlights to light up the dark side of the moon and enough canned beans to sustain a small army through a decade of siege. It is the American way. We ignore the danger for 30 years, and then we spend 3 weeks trying to buy our way out of the consequences. The price of the dream. Why do they stay? That is the question I asked the empty air. Why would anyone live in a place where the floor is essentially a trapdoor waiting to be sprung? I reckon it's because the California dream is a powerful intoxicant. It's the sunshine, the fame, the orange groves, and the intoxicating belief that you can reinvent yourself every morning. And for that privilege, the inhabitants are willing to pay the tectonic tax. They accept that every few decades, the earth will demand a tribute of broken windows and collapsed chimneys. They rebuild. That is the most hilarious and heroic part of the whole business. Before the dust had even settled on the Northridge Freeway, they were already planning the new one. They were buying more china, building more pools on more hillsides, and convincing themselves that the big one is something that only happens to other people. It's a magnificent kind of stupidity. It's the same spirit that drove men to the gold fields in '49, knowing full well they'd likely die of scurvy or be shot over a salted mine. We are a race of gamblers, and California is the biggest table in the house. TwAIn's conclusion on the matter. As for me, I'll take the solid, unmoving ground of the afterlife, or at least the predictable swells of a river. A river might flood your basement, it might carry away your porch, and it might occasionally deposit a dead cow in your parlor, but it doesn't try to swallow the entire county in 20 seconds. The Northridge Shakedown was a reminder that for all our superhighways, our browsers, and our boxes of chocolates, we are still living on a very thin crust of uncertainty. We are like ants, building a palace on the back of a sleeping dog. The dog is mostly peaceful, but when it decides to scratch an itch, the palace is going to have some structural issues. 1994 started with a bang, literally. It was the year the Golden State was reminded that it's actually made of rock and sand, not gold and celluloid. I puffed on my spectral cigar and watched the people of Los Angeles pick up the pieces, admire their new mountains, and go right back to dreaming of their big break. I suppose I can't blame them. If I were still alive, I'd probably be trying to sell earthquake-proof cigars or TwAIn's Tectonic Tonic for the nerves. There's no sense in letting a good catastrophe go to waste without making a few dollars off the humbug. But for now, I'll just stay on my porch and watch the horizon. I've seen the earth move enough for one lifetime. I prefer it when the only thing shaking is the ice in a glass of lemonade and the only thing collapsing is a bad argument. Chapter 12. The Rwandan Shadow. I have often remarked that the secret source of humor itself is not joy but sorrow. There is no humor in heaven, but down here, where we are all currently marinating in the consequences of our own nature, humor is the only thing that keeps us from taking a long walk off a short pier. However, even for a man of my formidable cynicism, a man who has seen the Gilded Age and the Age of Enlightenment, and found them both to be remarkably dim, there are moments when the ink in my pen turns to bile and the cigar in my mouth tastes like ashes. In the spring and summer of 1994, while the American public was busy losing its mind over a football player in a white truck, and while the English were busy digging a tunnel so they could be rude to the French in person, a darkness descended upon a small green country in Africa called Rwanda. And it is here that the hilarious history of our species takes a turn so sharp and so jagged that it threatens to tear the very hull out of our collective dignity. The global village and its broken windows. We were told, you see, that we were entering the era of the global village. Between the World Wide Web, the information superhighway, and the Netscape Navigator, the world was supposed to be shrinking. We were all going to be neighbors. We were going to share our recipes, our music, and our cool coffee pot cameras. We were going to be one big, happy, interconnected family of man. But 1994 proved that the global village is a place where we are perfectly happy to watch our neighbor's house burn to the ground, provided the smoke doesn't blow toward our own porch and the screams don't interrupt the box of chocolates philosophy of our favorite moving pictures. In Rwanda, in the span of a mere 100 days, nearly 1 million souls were extinguished with a level of mechanical hand-delivered cruelty that would have made a medieval inquisitor blush. It wasn't done with the high-tech weaponry of the coming century. It was done with machetes, with clubs, and with the kind of intimate face-to-face hatred that requires a man to look into the eyes of his victim and see a monster where there is only a neighbor. The great linguistic humbug. What fascinated and disgusted my spectral self was not just the slaughter, but the reaction of the civilized world. You see, we have these things called international agreements. We have the United Nations, a collection of gentlemen in very fine suits who meet in a very grand building in New York to discuss the state of the world over expensive mineral water. They had a word for what was happening in Rwanda: genocide. Now, genocide is a heavy word. It is a word that carries with it a moral and legal obligation to do something. If you admit a genocide is happening, you have to put down your mineral water, get out of your chair, and actually intervene. So, in one of the most spectacular displays of linguistic gymnastics I have ever witnessed, the leaders of the free world spent weeks arguing over whether what was happening was genocide or merely acts of genocide. It is a distinction that would be hilarious if it weren't so profoundly demonic. It's like standing in front of a man who is currently being eaten by a shark and saying, "Now wait a minute, let's be precise. Is he being devoured, or is he merely experiencing acts of being devoured? Until we have a committee report, I don't feel comfortable throwing him a rope." The United States, still nursing a bruise from a previous African misadventure in Somalia, decided that its national interest was best served by looking the other way. They even went so far as to order their diplomats to avoid using the G word. I've seen some cowards in my time. I've seen men hide in barrels to avoid a draft, but I've never seen a whole nation hide behind a dictionary to avoid a conscience. The blue helmets and the rules of the spectator. Then there were the blue helmets, the United Nations peacekeepers. They were there, on the ground, in the middle of the fire. They saw the roadblocks. They saw the rivers choked with bodies. They saw the madness in the eyes of the killers. And what were they told to do? They were told to monitor. I have a great deal of respect for the individual soldiers who were there, particularly a Canadian fellow named Dallaire, who begged and pleaded for the authority to actually save people. But his superiors in the great marble hall of humbug told him he wasn't allowed to use force. He was there to be a spectator. It is the 1994 ethos perfected. We will watch the tragedy. We will document the tragedy. We will broadcast the tragedy on the evening news with a very somber-looking anchor. But God forbid we should actually interrupt the tragedy. It would be against the rules. It would be a violation of sovereignty. I reckon if a man is being murdered in the street, the last thing he's worried about is the sovereignty of the fellow swinging the machete. He'd much rather a violation in the form of a well-placed bullet to the killer's head. But then, I'm just an old river pilot. I don't understand the delicate nuances of international diplomacy. I only understand that when a boat is sinking, you don't call a meeting to discuss the concept of buoyancy. You start bailing. The failure of the neighborhood. For all our information superhighways, we proved in 1994 that information is not the same thing as wisdom, and connection is not the same thing as community. We could see the dark spots on Jupiter from millions of miles away, but we couldn't see the dark spots on our own souls from across the Atlantic. We have built a world where we can send a Yahoo shout across the globe in a second, but we still struggle to hear the screams from across the fence. We are like a man who has the most expensive telegraph system in the world installed in his house, but who never bothers to step outside and see if his neighbor is drowning in the well. The Rwandan Shadow is the part of the 1994 book that we all want to skip. It doesn't fit with the Lion King or the PlayStation or the Soccer World Cup. It's the bitter pill at the bottom of the box of chocolates. But I believe it is the most important chapter of all, because it reminds us that the damned human race, as I am fond of calling us, hasn't actually changed much since the days of the caveman. We've just gotten better at pretending. We've traded the club for the machete and the silence of the wilderness for the noise of the internet. But the capacity for organized imaginative slaughter remains our most durable trait. A somber conclusion. I usually like to end my musings with a joke or a witty observation about the absurdity of our customs. But there is no wit in the hills of Rwanda. There is only the silence of the dead and the much louder silence of the living who did nothing. 1994 was a year of progress. We opened the channel, we launched the browsers, we watched the stars fall. But in a small green corner of the world, we proved that progress is a very thin coat of paint on a very old and very bloody fence. I'll go back to my lighter subjects in the next chapter. I'll talk about PlayStations and pulp fiction and the first banner ads on the web. We'll laugh again because that is what we do to keep the darkness at bay. But let us not forget the shadow. Let us not forget that for all our super highways, we are still a race that can lose its way in the dark in under an hour. I'm going to go sit on my spectral porch now and smoke a very long, very quiet cigar. I need to get the taste of 1994 out of my mouth. It's a bitter vintage, and no amount of Yahoo exclamations can quite cover the scent of what we left behind in the mud of Rwanda. We are a curious species indeed. We can map the heavens, but we can't find our way to a simple no when the devil comes knocking at the door with a machete and a mandate. Chapter 13. The PlayStation Revolution. I have observed throughout my various incarnations, both fleshy and vaporous, that the human race possesses a profound, almost desperate desire to be somewhere else. If a man is in the parlor, he wishes to be in the counting-house. If he is in the counting-house, he dreams of the fishing hole. And if he is finally at the fishing hole, he spends his time wondering if he left the stove on back at the parlor. We are a species of restless transients, never quite satisfied with the now, and always looking for a later that involves fewer chores and more snacks. In December of 1994, a company called Sony, which I previously associated with small buzzing pocket radios and the Walkman, a device that allows a man to ignore his wife's conversation while walking the dog, released a gray box in Japan called the PlayStation. Now, a station is usually a place where a train stops to let off passengers and take on coal. But this PlayStation was a destination in itself. It was a machine designed to transport a man into a world that doesn't exist, using nothing but the power of electricity and a television set that had already been sufficiently taxed by the slow-speed antics of Mr. Simpson and the moral philosophy of Mr. Gump. The geometry of joy, 3D polygons. The great selling point of this gray box was something called 3D polygons. I sat in the ether and listened as the young engineers spoke of these polygons with the hushed reverence usually reserved for the discovery of a new continent or a particularly profitable tax loophole. "Look at the polygons," they would shout, pointing at a character on the screen who looked remarkably like a collection of jagged triangles and trapezoids that had been glued together by a blind carpenter. In my day, if you wanted to see a three-dimensional object, you simply looked at a rock or a tree or a particularly rotund politician. It was a free service provided by nature. But in 1994, the human race decided it was much more sophisticated to pay $300 for a machine that could simulate a three-dimensional object. I find the math of it to be a high-order humbug. They take a triangle, the simplest, most boring shape in the universe, and they tell the machine to draw 10,000 of them every second. If you draw enough triangles and color them the right shade of sweaty skin, you eventually get a digital athlete or a fire-breathing dragon. It is the industrialization of the imagination. We have moved from the hand-drawn dreams of Mr. Disney to the calculated hallucinations of a microchip. The digital rosary, the controller. To interact with this machine, one must hold a controller. I examined this object and found it to be a masterpiece of ergonomic confusion. It has more buttons than a Victorian corset and two handles that make it look like the steering yoke of a very small, very confused airplane. I watched a young man in a darkened room. Let us call him the gamer, a title that suggests a level of professional commitment usually found in bridge players and card sharps. As he clutched this device, he was in a state of virtual trance. His thumbs moved with the frantic, rhythmic precision of a telegraph operator sending a distress signal from a sinking ship. A gamer is a man who will sit perfectly still for 14 hours staring at a box while his thumbs perform a marathon that would leave a Greek messenger gasping for air. He was playing a game called Ridge Racer. In this game, you drive a car very fast around a track that exists only in the mind of the machine. I watched him take a corner at 100 miles an hour, his body leaning into the turn as if the laws of centrifugal force applied to a leather sofa. He wasn't just watching the screen, he was in the screen. His real reality, the one with the unwashed laundry, the lukewarm pizza, and the unpaid rent, had ceased to exist. He had moved his residence to the virtual reality of the PlayStation, where the only thing that mattered was his lap time and the number of points he had accrued. The humbug of virtual reality. This brings me to the great irony of 1994. We spent that year building virtual realities at the exact moment our actual reality was becoming increasingly difficult to stomach. I've heard the futurists talk about virtual reality as if it were the salvation of the human race. They say we will one day wear goggles that make us believe we are walking on the moon or swimming with dolphins, all while we are actually sitting in a dingy basement in Ohio. But I ask you, why? The actual reality we currently possess is a magnificent piece of engineering. It has smells, it has textures, it has a sun that provides genuine warmth, and it has a variety of unpredictable weather patterns that keep a man on his toes. If you want to see a dolphin, you can go to the ocean and risk the indignity of a sunburn and a shark bite. That is the price of the experience. It is what makes the experience valuable. But the virtual reality of the PlayStation offers the experience without the price. You can be a hero without the danger. You can be a racer without the gasoline. You can be a king without the messy business of a revolution. It is the box of chocolates philosophy applied to the soul. You get all the sweetness and none of the calories, but eventually you realize you're still hungry because you haven't actually eaten anything. The miracle of the save game. There is one feature of this digital revolution, however, that I find profoundly enviable: the save game mechanic. In my life, if I made a mistake, such as investing my life savings in a machine that didn't work or publishing a book that nobody wanted to read, I had to live with the consequences. There was no reload button for Samuel Clemens. I couldn't go back to the previous Tuesday and tell myself to stay away from the stock market. I had to march forward into the disaster and hope for the best. But on the PlayStation, if you drive your car into a wall or get eaten by a digital monster, you simply press a button and return to a moment before the catastrophe occurred. It is the ultimate humbug. It is the denial of the fundamental law of the universe, that actions have consequences. Imagine if history had a save game feature. If Napoleon could have reloaded his save at Waterloo, if the captain of the Titanic could have gone back to the previous checkpoint and steered 10 degrees to the left, the world would be a much tidier place, certainly, but it would also be remarkably dull. It is the risk of the game over that makes the game worth playing. By removing the risk, Sony has turned the drama of life into a harmless loop. The PlayStation habit. As 1994 drew to a close, I realized that the PlayStation was not just a toy. It was a habitat. We were beginning to see the rise of a generation that would rather navigate a digital dungeon than navigate a real conversation. I watched a group of young men playing a game together. They were in the same room, but they weren't looking at each other. They were looking at the screen. They were communicating in a series of grunts, shouts, and frantic button presses. They were connecting, but it was a connection mediated by a gray box and a series of polygons. It is a hilarious spectacle to witness. We build these massive global networks to bring the world together, and the first thing we do with them is retreat into a digital cave to play a game where we pretend to be a hedgehog or a soldier. I suppose I shouldn't be too hard on the boys. I spent my own youth pretending to be a pirate or a pilot, and I did it with nothing more than a wooden stick and a vivid imagination. The PlayStation is just a much more expensive version of that wooden stick. It provides the imagination so the child doesn't have to. TwAIn's final score. As I look at the blinking red light of the PlayStation from my post in the ether, I feel a strange mixture of pity and admiration. I admire the cleverness of the polygons and the sheer unmitigated audacity of selling a virtual reality to a race that hasn't even mastered the real one yet. But I pity the gamer. I pity the man who spends his best years chasing a high score that will be forgotten as soon as the power goes out. I pity the man who has traded the smell of the river for the hum of a cooling fan. 1994 was the year we decided that reality was a bit too much work and that play should be a professional occupation. We started the year watching a white Bronco and ended it watching a gray box. It seems the American public is moving from the spectator to the participant, but the participation is limited to the movement of two thumbs. I reckon I'll stay here in my actual afterlife. It's got plenty of texture, the cigars are free, and I don't need a controller to tell a good story. But if you see a man in a white suit wandering around a digital dungeon in a PlayStation game, don't be surprised. I might just be looking for the save button so I can go back to 1894 and tell myself to buy some stock in a little company called Sony. After all, if you can't beat the humbug, you might as well own a piece of it. Chapter 14. The Pulp Fiction Prose. I have always believed that if you are going to tell a lie, you should make it a magnificent one. And if you're going to tell a story, you should at least have the decency to start at the beginning. But in the autumn of 1994, a young man named Quentin Tarantino, a gentleman who possesses the caffeinated energy of a squirrel in a locomotive factory, and the chin of a man who has decided to lead with his best feature, released a moving picture that treated the concept of time like a deck of cards in the hands of a riverboat cheat. The movie was titled Pulp Fiction. Now, pulp refers to that cheap, ragged paper made from wood shavings, the kind used for the sort of sensational magazines that respectable people claim they never read while they are surreptitiously stuffing them into their coat pockets. It is the literature of the lurid, the home of the private eye, the femme fatale, and the man with the gun who has more adjectives than sense. But Mr. Tarantino did something quite clever. He took the pulp and gave it the pedigree. He took the gutter and gave it a tuxedo. And in doing so, he convinced the entire world that a movie about talkative assassins and a glowing briefcase was the most profound philosophical treatise since the Greeks stopped arguing and started sculpting. The Shuffled Deck of Destiny. The first thing that struck my spectral sensibilities was the structure of the piece. As a writer, I was taught that a story should proceed from A to B, and eventually, if the reader hasn't fallen asleep or the author hasn't run out of ink, to C. It is a linear progression, much like the flow of a river. You start at the headwaters and you end at the Gulf. But pulp fiction is a river that has been chopped into segments, rearranged by a madman, and then poured back into the channel in whatever order seemed most amusing at the time. You see a man die in the middle of the story, only to have him reappear in the final act, sitting in a diner and contemplating the nature of the divine while eating a plate of muffins. At first, I found this to be a grand humbug, a trick played on the audience's patience. But as I watched, I realized that Mr. Tarantino was actually being more honest than the rest of us. Life, as I have often observed, does not happen in a straight line. We experience it in a jumble of memories, regrets, and sudden, violent interruptions. We are always flashing back to a mistake we made 10 years ago, or flashing forward to a dinner we haven't eaten yet. By shuffling the deck, Tarantino managed to capture the frantic, disjointed rhythm of the modern mind. It was the perfect movie for 1994, a year when we were already being bombarded by hyperlinks, browsers, and 144-channel cable television. Our attention spans were already being pulverized into pulp, so why not have our movies follow suit? The gastronomy of the underworld. What truly sets this picture apart, however, is not the violence, though there is enough red ink spilled to satisfy a battalion of schoolmarms, but the talk. I have spent a lifetime listening to the damned human race talk. I've listened to miners in Nevada discuss the price of beans. I've listened to senators in Washington discuss the price of votes. And I've listened to pilots on the Mississippi discuss the price of a life. But I have never heard criminals talk like Mr. Tarantino's criminals. There is a scene where two assassins, played by a resurrected John Travolta, and a man named Samuel L. Jackson, who possesses a voice that could make a grocery list sound like a prophecy, are driving to a job. Do they discuss the grim logistics of their profession? Do they brood over the morality of their actions? No. They discuss the culinary differences between American and European fast food. They talk about the Royale with cheese. As a man who once wrote a book called The Innocents Abroad, I found this deeply moving. I, too, have traveled through Europe and been baffled by their insistence on using the metric system for things that ought to be measured in honest inches. To hear a hitman explain that a quarter-pounder is called a Royale with cheese, because the French wouldn't know a pound if it hit them in the face, is a piece of observational comedy that I would have been proud to claim as my own. It revealed a fundamental truth. Even murderers have mundane interests. Even the most desperate scoundrels spend 90% of their time discussing the weather, the quality of the coffee, and the peculiar habits of their neighbors. It is the other 10%, the shooting and the shouting, that makes the newspapers. But it's the 90% of talk that makes a human being. The resurrection of the dancer. We must also pause to discuss the miracle of John Travolta. In the 1970s, Mr. Travolta was a national monument to polyester and the disco fever. By the early 1990s, however, he had become a bit of a historical footnote, a man whose career was primarily associated with talking babies and movies that were released directly to the bargain bin of the video store. But Tarantino, in a display of true Gumpian luck, or perhaps sheer stubborn genius, cast him as Vincent Vega. Suddenly, the man who had been the king of the dance floor was a slouching, heroin-addicted philosopher with a ponytail and a silver tongue. I watched the famous dance scene at Jack Rabbit Slim's, and I realized I was witnessing a rehabilitation even more impressive than Richard Nixon's. Travolta moved with a heavy, languid grace that suggested he had seen everything the world had to offer and found most of it to be a bit of a bore. He didn't just dance, he existed with style. It taught the 1994 audience a valuable lesson. In America, you are never truly finished. You're just waiting for the right director to find you, give you a gun and a leather jacket, and tell you to talk about burgers for 10 minutes. If you live long enough and keep your chin up, the pulp of your life can always be reprinted in a new edition. The briefcase and the great humbug. Then, of course, there is the briefcase. Throughout the film, everyone is chasing a black briefcase. When it is opened, a golden light spills out, illuminating the faces of the characters with a heavenly glow. We never see what is inside. We are never told what it contains. Is it the soul of a man? Is it the stolen gold of a king? Is it the original manuscript of Huckleberry Finn? I suspect not, as the characters seemed much more impressed than the average reader. It is what the scholars call a MacGuffin, but I call it the ultimate humbug. It is a hole in the story that the audience is invited to fill with their own greed. By not showing us the contents, Tarantino ensured that the briefcase would be more valuable than anything he could have actually put in it. If he had shown us a pile of diamonds, we would have said, "Oh, diamonds, how predictable." But by showing us nothing but a golden light, he gave us the universe. It is a trick I've used myself. The things you don't say are always more powerful than the things you do. The ghost you don't see is always scarier than the one that's rattling the chains in the parlor. Violence as a punchline. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the violence. It is sudden, it is messy, and most controversially, it is often funny. There is a moment where a character is accidentally shot in the back of a car during a conversation about nothing in particular. In any other movie, this would be a tragedy. In Pulp Fiction, it is a logistical problem. The rest of the scene is devoted to the characters cleaning the bits of brain out of the upholstery before the owner of the house gets home. I saw the critics wringing their hands over this. "Is nothing sacred?" they cried. "Is death now a joke?" To which I reply, death has always been a joke. It's just that most of us don't have the stomach to laugh at the punchline. I've seen enough of the damned human race to know that we are absurd creatures, and our exits from this world are often as ridiculous as our entries. To treat violence with a certain dark hilarity is not a sign of a lack of soul. It is a sign of a man who has looked the world in the eye and realized it's a comedy of errors from start to finish. TwAIn's closing credits. By the time the credits rolled, accompanied by that frantic surf guitar music that sounds like a shark trying to play the banjo, I realized that 1994 had found its voice. It was a voice that was cynical, witty, self-referential, and deeply obsessed with its own history. Pulp Fiction was the Netscape navigator of cinema. It allowed the audience to click between different stories, to browse through different genres, and to feel as though they were in on the joke. It turned the audience into collaborators in the humbug. I reckon I'll stay here in the afterlife and watch it again. I want to see if I can figure out what's in that briefcase. I suspect it's a box of cigars and a map to a place where the metric system hasn't been invented yet. But even if it's just a light bulb and some yellow cellophane, I don't mind. A good story doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to keep you from looking at your watch until the shooting starts. 1994, the year of the shuffled deck. We're moving in circles, we're talking about cheese, and we're all looking for the golden light in the briefcase. I only hope we find it before the end sign comes up and we have to go back to our real reality, where the burgers don't have fancy names and the killers don't quote the Bible before they pull the trigger. Next up, we'll see how the internet decided to stop being a library and start being a billboard. Chapter 15, The First Digital Banner. I have often observed that the quickest way to ruin a beautiful thing, be it a pristine sunset, a quiet stretch of the Mississippi, or a promising new invention, is to allow a man with a sales philosophy to get within shouting distance of it. For centuries, the peddler and the huckster were limited by the physical capacity of their lungs and the endurance of their horses. A snake oil salesman in 1870 could only lie to perhaps 50 people at a time before someone realized the miracle elixir was mostly turpentine and chased him out of town with a heavy stick. But in October of 1994, the damned human race achieved a miracle of industrial-scale annoyance. We witnessed the birth of the first digital banner advertisement. Up until this point, the World Wide Web had been a relatively polite neighborhood. It was a place for scientists to share charts that nobody understood, for students to post pictures of their dorm room ferrets, and for the aforementioned Yahoo boys to try and organize the chaos. It was a great library where the only thing you had to pay was attention. But then a publication called Hot Wired, the digital offspring of Wired magazine, which is a periodical dedicated to the belief that the future will be shiny, fast, and remarkably expensive, decided to sell a small rectangular slice of its soul to a company called AT&T. The prophecy of the click. The advertisement itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was a black rectangle with rainbow-colored text that asked a question so arrogant it bordered on the divine. Have you ever clicked your mouse right here? And then, in a smaller, more sinister font, it provided the answer, you will. Now, as a man who has spent a significant portion of his life trying to avoid being told what to do by editors, creditors, and the clergy, I found this "you will" to be a most offensive piece of impertinence. It wasn't an invitation, it was a prophecy. It was the digital equivalent of a man grabbing you by the lapels on a public street and shouting, "You will eventually buy a toothbrush from me, Samuel, so you might as well surrender now." But the most hilarious part of the whole business was the reaction of the 1994 public. You must understand that in 1994, the mouse click was still a novelty. People clicked on things just to see if they would move. It was a new toy, and we were all like kittens batting at a ball of yarn. When the banner told the public, "You will," the public responded with a collective, "I reckon I will," and clicked on it with a fervor usually reserved for the opening of a tax refund check. Nearly 44% of the people who saw that ad clicked on it. In the modern world, if 44% of people agree on anything, even the fact that fire is hot, it is considered a statistical miracle. But in 1994, we were innocent. We didn't know that the black rectangle was actually a trapdoor of commerce. The digital snake oil. I am well acquainted with the banner of the old world. In my day, it was a piece of canvas stretched across a muddy street, informing the public that Dr. Kilmer's swamp root would cure everything from baldness to a guilty conscience. It was loud, it was colorful, and you could ignore it by simply looking at your boots. But the digital banner is a different breed of cat. It is a billboard that follows you into your house. It is a handbill that pastes itself onto the very book you're trying to read. When you clicked that first AT&T banner, you weren't taken to a shop. You were taken to a virtual tour of museums, sponsored by the telephone company. It was a brilliant humbug. They weren't trying to sell you a telephone, not yet. They were trying to associate their brand with the future. That is a modern phrase that means spending millions of dollars to make people forget that your actual service is mediocre and your prices are usurious. AT&T wanted you to think that they were the architects of the information superhighway. They wanted you to believe that without their black rectangle, you would be lost in the digital woods. It was the same tactic used by the men who sold magnetic belts in the 1890s. They didn't sell the belt. They sold the idea that you were vibrant and modern for wearing it. The death of the library, the birth of the mall. I watched from the ether as that single black rectangle multiplied like rabbits in a clover field. Within months, the World Wide Web looked less like a great library and more like a scenic highway in New Jersey that had been papered over with advertisements for motels, indigestion remedies, and political candidates of questionable character. We had been promised a new enlightenment. We were told that the Internet would be a place where the collective wisdom of the human race would be available to all, free from the grubby hands of the merchants. But 1994 taught us the golden rule of the digital age. If the information is free, it is because you are the cargo being sold to the advertiser. Suddenly, the navigator was no longer just helping you find a map of Tokyo or a poem by Keats. It was helping the advertisers find you. They started talking about click-through rates and impressions. An impression is what happens when a man looks at an advertisement and thinks, "I wish that weren't there." A click-through is what happens when that same man accidentally moves his mouse while sneezing. We were being tracked. In the old days, a peddler didn't know who you were until you spoke to him. But the digital banner began the process of data collection, a fancy term for a machine that hides under your bed and takes notes on what kind of shoes you like, and how often you look at pictures of cheese. The aesthetic tragedy. As a man who appreciates the texture of life, I found the visual invasion to be the most galling part of the 1994 revolution. The early web had a certain clunky amateur charm. It was built by enthusiasts. But the banner ad introduced a new kind of professional ugliness. These banners were designed to be eye-catching, which is a polite way of saying they were designed to be as distracting as a firecracker in a library. They blinked. They flashed. They used colors that have no business existing in nature, neon periwinkle and electric chartreuse. They were the loud waistcoats of the digital world, shouting for attention, while the actual content of the page tried to hide in the corners. I began to worry that the human eye would eventually evolve to simply not see the middle of the screen. We would become a race of people who only look at the margins, searching for the close button, that tiny, elusive X that is always smaller than the tip of a needle and hidden against a background of the same color. The humbug of free. The great justification for this invasion was that it paid for the content. This is the oldest lie in the history of the press. I heard it when I was a cub reporter in Virginia City, and I heard it when I was a publisher in New York. We must have the advertisements, or we cannot afford to tell you the truth. But what happens when the truth becomes inconvenient for the advertiser? If I am writing a scathing expose on the great telephone monopoly, and my page is sponsored by a great telephone monopoly, I suspect my editor will suddenly find my prose to be a trifle too aggressive, and suggest I write a lovely piece about the history of the tulip instead. By introducing the banner ad, 1994 ensured that the information superhighway would eventually become a toll road. You don't pay with coins. You pay with your privacy and your peace of mind. Every time you click right here, you're handing over a small piece of your soul to a company that wants to sell you a Royale with cheese, or a PlayStation, or a box of chocolates. TwAIn's prophecy. As I sat back and watched the You Will banner blink its multicolored threat at a gullible nation, I realized that the 20th century was ending exactly as the 19th had, with a salesman in a fancy suit telling us that the future is just one click away. I reckon that in 100 years, the entire World Wide Web will be nothing but one giant advertisement with a small microscopic skip ad button that can only be activated by a man who has lived a blameless life and knows the secret password of the Masons. We have turned the greatest invention in history into a digital billboard. We have taken the ether and filled it with electronic junk mail. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Man is a creature who, if given the chance to speak to God, would likely ask if he has any openings for a brand ambassador. I'll stay here on my porch. There are no banners in the afterlife, though I did see a ghost the other day wearing a sandwich board that said, "Repent." And I couldn't help but notice he'd spelled it wrong. Even in eternity, the sales philosophy never sleeps. But remember the AT&T banner. Remember the You Will. Because they were right. We did. And we haven't stopped clicking since, even though we're still waiting for the museums and the miracles they promised us. All we got was a monthly bill and a computer that knows too much about our preference for breakfast cereal. 1994, the year the free web died and the targeted consumer was born. I'm going to go see if I can find a block button for my own memories. I suspect it's hidden behind a rainbow-colored rectangle that says, "Click here to forget." Chapter 16. The Death of the Tricky One. Death, as I have frequently noted from my current position of expertise, is often the most strategic career move a politician can make. In life, a statesman is plagued by the inconveniences of facts, the persistence of creditors, and the unfortunate tendency of the public to remember what he said last Tuesday. But once he has shuffled off this mortal coil and surrendered his briefcase to the great auditor in the sky, he undergoes a most miraculous transformation. He ceases to be a man and becomes a legacy. And in America, a legacy is a piece of property that can be polished, repainted, and sold back to the public at a premium, regardless of how many snags the man hit while he was still steering the boat. In April of 1994, the damned human race was called upon to perform this ritual for a gentleman named Richard Milhouse Nixon, a man known to his friends as Dick, to his enemies as Tricky, and to the history books as the only inhabitant of the White House to ever decide that the exit sign was more appealing than the impeachment proceedings. The Great American Rehabilitation. I watched the proceedings in Yorba Linda, California, with a fascination that bordered on the scientific. You see, I am well acquainted with the scoundrel's progress. In my day, if a man was caught with his hand in the till or his ear to the keyhole of a political rival, he generally had the decency to retire to a quiet farm or change his name and move to Nevada. But Mr. Nixon was a stayer. He possessed a level of grim persistence that would have made a bulldog look like a quitter. He had left Washington in 1974 in a cloud of disgrace so thick you could have used it to pave a road. He had been the tricky one, the man of the secret tapes, the fellow who looked at the Constitution and saw a series of polite suggestions rather than a set of rules. And yet, by 1994, he was being buried like a saint. I call this the completion of the book theory. In America, if you simply refuse to die when people are angry at you, and you keep writing books and wearing suits and offering advice on foreign policy, which is a fancy term for how we intend to swindle the neighbors next year, the public eventually gets tired of hating you. They decide that because you are old and have a dignified tremor in your hand, you must have been a great man all along. The American public has a memory like a sieve, and it is a sieve that only catches the gold and lets the mud wash away. If you live to be 80, you aren't a crook anymore. You're an institution. A pentagram of presidents. The funeral was a spectacle of the highest order. It featured something rarely seen in nature, 5 American presidents standing in a row. It was a pentagram of power, a collection of men who had all held the great steering wheel and had all, at one time or another, run the boat into a sandbar. There was the incumbent, Clinton, a young man with a silver tongue and a penchant for saxophone music, who spoke of Nixon's wisdom. The silent one, Bush, who looked as though he were counting the minutes until he could go back to his golf game. The great communicator, Reagan, who was currently drifting into a virtual reality of his own, God bless him. The peanut farmer, Carter, looking remarkably moral and slightly uncomfortable, as if he'd wandered into the wrong church. The accidental one, Ford, the man who had pardoned the tricky one and lived to tell the tale, To see these 5 men standing together, honoring a man who had nearly dismantled the machinery of their own office, was a triumph of the political humbug. It was a message to the world. In this country, we may fight, we may scheme, and we may occasionally break the law, but when the music stops, we all wear the same suit and say the same nice things over the casket. It was a rehabilitation so complete that I expected Mr. Nixon to sit up, flash the double V for victory, and ask if anyone had a spare tape recorder. The ghost of Watergate. Of course, the Watergate business was handled with the delicate touch of a man trying to describe a train wreck without mentioning the locomotives. They spoke of adversity and challenges and the burdens of leadership. I remember Watergate. It was a magnificent piece of low-budget burglary. In my time, if you wanted to steal an election, you bought the voters with whiskey and $5 bills. It was an honest, straightforward transaction. But Nixon's people decided to break into a hotel to steal information. They wanted to know what the other side was thinking. And then there were the tapes. Ah, the tapes! As a man who has spent his life trying to capture the human voice on paper, I have a certain appreciation for a man who records his own downfall for posterity. Mr. Nixon had a voice-activated system in the Oval Office. It recorded everything: the plotting, the swearing, the moments of profound insecurity, and the occasional order for a sandwich. He was the first reality star, 30 years before the world became obsessed with the white Bronco. He gave us a peek behind the curtain, and we were horrified to find that the Wizard of Oz was actually a man in a rumpled suit, worrying about his enemies list and the price of his own reputation. But by 1994, the tapes were historical documents. The "I am not a crook" line, perhaps the most hilariously unconvincing statement in the history of the English language, had become a piece of folklore, like Washington and the cherry tree or Lincoln and the log cabin. We don't care if the story is true or if the man was a scoundrel. We just like the way the line sounds when we say it at a dinner party. The elder statesman costume. In the final years of his life, Nixon had mastered the art of the elder statesman. He traveled to Russia, he traveled to China, and he wrote books with titles like Beyond Peace and The Real War. He reinvented himself as the wise old owl of the Republican Party. It was a brilliant piece of theater. If you act like you know a secret that nobody else knows, people will eventually start paying you to tell it to them. Nixon realized that while he couldn't be loved, he could be useful. And in the world of politics, being useful is a much more durable commodity than being liked. I saw him on the television, his jowls shaking with a solemn gravity, advising the nation on how to handle the New World Order. And the nation listened. The same nation that had demanded his resignation 20 years earlier was now leaning in to hear his thoughts on the Netscape Navigator and the Global Village. It taught me that the tricky one was the ultimate navigator. He had steered his own reputation through the most treacherous waters imaginable, and he had brought it into the harbor of respectability just as the sun was going down. A final retrospective on forgiveness. Why did we forgive him? I believe it is because, in 1994, we were starting to realize that the new world was even more confusing than the old one. We had the comet hitting Jupiter, we had the Amazon bookstore in a garage, and we had the World Wide Web trying to fence in the wind. In the face of such chaotic change, a man like Nixon, a man we knew, a man whose flaws were as familiar to us as a comfortable pair of old boots, seemed almost comforting. He represented a time when a scandal involved a break-in at a hotel, rather than a global information war or a geneto-digital crisis. We forgave him because we wanted to finish the book. We wanted a tidy ending to the long national nightmare. And so we gathered in California, we flew the flags at half-staff, and we told ourselves that he was a patriot. I'll give the tricky one this. He knew how to take a curtain call. He stayed on the stage until the audience forgot why they were booing, and then he bowed and exited to thunderous applause. It was a humbug of truly presidential proportions. As the pentagram of presidents stood over the grave, I puffed on my spectral cigar and smiled. The human race is a funny thing. We demand honesty and integrity from our leaders, but what we truly admire is the man who can fall down a flight of stairs and convince us he was just taking a shortcut to the basement. Richard Nixon was the king of the shortcut. He's gone now to a place where I suspect the tapes are always running and there are no save games or pardons. I hope he brought a good lawyer. He's going to need one once the great auditor starts asking about the 18.5-minute gap in his celestial records. But here in 1994, the book is closed. The legacy is polished. And the tricky one has finally achieved his greatest victory. He made us miss him, if only for an afternoon. Next up, we'll move from the grave to the savannah. Chapter 17, The Lion King's Circle. I suggest you bring a handkerchief. Disney is about to explain the circle of life to a nation that's still trying to figure out where Mr. Nixon went. Chapter 17, The Lion King's Circle. I have often observed that if you wish to convince a human being of a profound moral truth, the surest way is to dress that truth in fur, give it a tail, and have it sing a ballad in a tenor voice. In my day, we were forced to get our morality from stern men in black coats who smelled of mothballs and brimstone. But by the summer of 1994, the American public had decided that the most reliable source of existential wisdom was a cartoon lion living on a pile of rocks in Africa. The moving picture was titled The Lion King. It was produced by the House of the Mouse, that sprawling digital kingdom where the mice are in charge, the ducks wear no trousers, and the children are systematically relieved of their parents' hard-earned coin in exchange for a few hours of colorful hallucination. Hamlet with fur and a better soundtrack. The plot of this masterpiece, as I noted from my spectral balcony, is essentially Mr. Shakespeare's Hamlet, but with the brooding prince replaced by a fuzzy cub and the ghostly father appearing in a thundercloud instead of on a castle rampart. It is a story of regicide, exile, and the eventual triumph of the rightful heir, a narrative as old as the hills, but given a fresh coat of paint and a collection of songs that possess the terrifying power to lodge themselves in the human brain and refuse to leave for several decades. I watched as the entire animal kingdom gathered at the foot of Pride Rock to witness the presentation of the infant Simba. There were elephants, giraffes, zebras, and various other creatures who, in the real reality, spend their days trying to avoid being disemboweled by the very lions they were now bowing to. It was a magnificent display of diplomatic humbug. To see a gazelle cheer for the birth of its future assassin is a testament to the power of a good musical score. If you play the right chords on a piano, you can convince a victim to celebrate the health of the predator. I've seen politicians use the same trick, though they usually use a brass band and a flag instead of a mandrill with a magic staff. The circle of life and the buffet of mortality. The central philosophy of the film is the circle of life. Mufasa, the king, voiced by a man with a baritone so deep it could cause a minor earthquake in the next county, explains to his son that when we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and so we are all connected. Now, as a man who has spent a significant portion of his life trying to avoid being connected to the ground in any permanent fashion, I found this to be a most elegant piece of salesmanship. It is the ultimate consolation for being lunch. The circle of life is a beautiful concept, provided you are the one doing the eating. If you are the antelope, it is simply a very poetic way of saying you are part of a global catering service. The 1994 audience found this deeply moving. They walked out of the theater feeling as though they had grasped the great mystery of the universe. They didn't mind that the circle is actually just a very long, very polite way of describing a buffet where the menu eventually eats the guests. But that is the genius of Disney. They can take the grim reality of the food chain and turn it into a sunset-drenched hymn that makes a man want to buy a commemorative plush toy. The comparison of monarchs. In my travels through Europe, I had the misfortune to meet several actual monarchs. I've seen Habsburgs with chins that required their own zip codes, and Hohenzollerns who possessed the charisma of a damp brick. They were, for the most part, a collection of doddering relics who believed they were chosen by God to tax the poor and wear heavy jewelry. I can say with some authority that Mufasa is a much more dignified king than any of the European variety. For one, he actually does his own hunting. A European king wouldn't know how to catch a chicken if it were tied to his wrist, let alone a wildebeest. Furthermore, a lion king at least has the decency to look like a king. He has the mane, the roar, and the habit of sitting on a high rock to look at the horizon. A European king usually just sits in a drafty palace and looks at his watch. I'll take a feline autocrat over a human one any day. A lion might eat you, but he won't make you listen to a 3-hour speech about the divine right of kings before he does it. He'll just get on with the business, which is a form of honesty that is sadly lacking in the parliaments of the world. The Shakespearean villain, Scar. Then there is Scar, the king's brother and the architect of the great regicide. He is a magnificent villain. He is lean, he is sarcastic, and he possesses a British accent, which in American cinema is the universal shorthand for "I am currently plotting to ruin your afternoon." Scar represents the political scoundrel in his purest form. He doesn't want to lead the lions because he cares about the circle of life. He wants to lead them because he likes the view from the top and he enjoys the company of hyenas, who, I must say, are the most accurate representation of low-level party officials I have ever seen. They are noisy, they are greedy, and they will turn on their leader the moment the snacks run out. Scar's musical number, Be Prepared, is a masterpiece of revolutionary rhetoric. It involves green fire, goose-stepping hyenas, and a promise that the coup of the century is at hand. I've heard similar speeches in the back rooms of Nevada saloons and the halls of Congress, though they usually involved less singing and more cigar smoke. The Apostles of Apathy, Hakuna Matata. After the death of Mufasa, a scene that caused a national shortage of handkerchiefs and taught a generation of children that their parents are in fact mortal. The young Simba flees into the desert. There, he meets the two most important philosophers of the 1990s, a meerkat named TwAIn and a warthog named Pumbaa. Their philosophy is summarized in the phrase Hakuna Matata. They tell us it means no worries for the rest of your days. It is the Gump philosophy set to a jaunty beat. It is the information superhighway after a 3-day weekend. It is the belief that if the world is a mess and your uncle has murdered your father and taken over your kingdom, the best course of action is to move to a jungle, eat bugs, and sing songs about your own lack of responsibility. Hakuna Matata is the national anthem of the lazy, the carefree, and the people who have successfully ignored their mail for 6 months. In 1994, this was exactly what the public wanted to hear. We were tired of the shadow in Rwanda, the shakedown in Northridge, and the tricky one in the grave. We wanted to be like the warthog. We wanted to believe that life's problems would simply vanish if we stopped thinking about them and started eating slimy yet satisfying grubs. The digital stampede. I must mention the technical wizardry of the wildebeest stampede. The Disney artists use computer-generated imagery, the same digital sorcery used to make the comets hit Jupiter, to create 3 minutes of sheer, unadulterated terror. They didn't draw every wildebeest by hand. No, they told the machine to think like a wildebeest and then told it to run. The result was a sequence so powerful that it made the audience forget they were looking at a series of glowing dots on a screen. It was the first time I realized that the manual age was truly over. From now on, our nightmares would be manufactured by microchips, and our tears would be harvested by algorithms. The return of the king. Eventually, of course, Simba realizes that you cannot eat bugs forever. The ghost of his father appears in the clouds, a scene that I personally found a bit too theatrical, though I suppose I'm a bit biased when it comes to ghostly apparitions, and tells him to remember who you are. Simba goes back, fights Scar, the hyenas go hungry, and the circle of life is restored. The rain falls, the grass grows, and everyone goes back to the comfortable arrangement of being eaten in the proper order. I watched the final scene as Simba's own cub was held aloft over the savannah, and I felt a pang of nostalgic amusement. Disney had managed to turn the most violent, chaotic, and indifferent system in nature into a heartwarming family story. They had successfully sold the circle to a nation of square people. TwAIn's final roar. 1994 was the year of the lion. We were all Simba, trying to find our way back to Pride Rock after a long walk through the desert of the 20th century. We were all looking for a king who was dignified, a philosophy that was simple, and a song that we could hum while the world went to blazes. I'll stick to the Hakuna Matata for now. It's a bit irresponsible, and it involves more bugs than I'm comfortable with, but it beats worrying about the Netscape Navigator or the first digital banner. If life is truly a circle, I'm just glad I'm currently at the part where I get to sit on a cloud and watch the show. I only hope the next cub they hold up isn't wearing a banner ad for a long-distance telephone company. That would be a tragedy that even Mr. Shakespeare couldn't fix. Next up, we'll see what happens when the information superhighway starts trying to read the fine print. Chapter 18, The Web Crawler. I suggest you hold on to your hat. The search is about to begin, and I suspect we're all going to find a lot more than we were looking for. Chapter 18, The Web Crawler. I have always believed that the greatest joy in life, aside from a good cigar and the successful avoidance of a relative, is the act of discovery. In my day, discovery was a physical, sweat-soaked business. If you wanted to find a new island, you had to hire a boat and risk being eaten by cannibals. If you wanted to find a specific book in a library, you had to engage in a duel of wits with a librarian who possessed the temperament of a badger and a filing system known only to herself and the Almighty. But by mid-1994, the damned human race decided that effort was a relic of the past. Having already organized the World Wide Web into a series of neat little folders via the Yahoo boys, we realized that even folders were too much work. We didn't want to browse. We wanted to summon. Enter a young gentleman named Brian Pinkerton at the University of Washington, who unleashed a creature into the digital ether known as the web crawler. The arrival of the eight-legged librarian. Now, as I mentioned when we discussed the Netscape Navigator, the word web implies a trap. And what lives in a web? A spider. The web crawler was the first successful search engine that performed what the scholars call full-text indexing. To the layman, this means the machine doesn't just look at the title of a page, it scurries through every single word, every sentence, and every punctuation mark on every page in existence, and writes them all down in a giant, invisible ledger. I find the name web crawler to be remarkably honest and profoundly unsettling. It suggests a tiny, multi-legged automaton scurrying through the dark corridors of the Internet at 3 o'clock in the morning, peeking through your digital keyholes and reading your private correspondence to see if you've used the word kumquat or insurrection. In my time, if I caught a stranger crawling through my library and taking notes on the contents of my desk, I would have greeted him with a double-barreled shotgun and a lecture on the sanctity of private property. In 1994, however, we invited the spider in. We gave it a cup of tea and asked it to tell us where the neighbors kept their silver. The death of serendipity. The great tragedy of the web crawler is that it has murdered the happy accident. I remember the old New York Public Library. You would go in looking for a volume on the history of the steam engine, and because you were human and therefore prone to distraction, your eye would wander to the shelf below. There you would find a book on the secret lives of Venetian gondoliers, or a treatise on the medicinal uses of swamp mud. You would spend the next 4 hours reading something you never knew you wanted to know, and you would emerge a wiser, more interesting man. But the web crawler is a cold-blooded assassin of curiosity. You type in steam engine, and the spider returns a list of 10,000 pages that contain the words steam and engine. It doesn't suggest a book on gondoliers. It doesn't invite you to wander. It simply hands you the specific needle you asked for and tells you to move along. A search engine is a machine that gives you exactly what you asked for, thereby ensuring you never find what you actually need. We are becoming a race of specialists who know everything about nothing. We have replaced the stroll through the woods with the sniper's scope. We are so focused on the target that we have forgotten the scenery exists. The humbug of the full text. Let us examine the math of this full text indexing. In 1994, this was growing at a rate that would make a rabbit blush. Brian Pinkerton's spider had to read all of it. Every misspelled word, every redundant thought, every lie told by a politician, and every poem written by a teenager who has just discovered that life is meaningless. The web crawler treats all these words with equal reverence. To a spider, the word liberty in a speech by Lincoln is worth exactly the same as the word liberty in an advertisement for a half-priced corset. It lacks the moral filter. This is the great humbug of the information age. We believe that because we have access to all the words, we possess all the knowledge. But knowledge is not a pile of bricks. It is the architecture you build with them. The web crawler gives you the bricks, but it doesn't give you the blueprint. It just dumps 1,000,000 tons of full text on your front lawn and wishes you a nice afternoon. The new Library of Babel. I am reminded of that fellow Borges and his Library of Babel, a library that contains every possible combination of letters, meaning it contains every truth, every lie, and a vast, staggering amount of pure gibberish. The web crawler turned the internet into that library. Before the crawler, the web was a collection of things people wanted you to find. After the crawler, the web became a collection of everything that existed. I watched as people began to search for themselves. This is a most peculiar modern vanity. A man will sit down, type his own name into the web crawler, and wait with bated breath to see if the spider has found him. If the spider returns, no results. The man feels a sudden, chilling sense of non-existence, as if he were a ghost who has forgotten to rattle his chains. "I am not in the index," he cries. "Therefore, I am not in the world." I tried it myself. I typed Mark Twain into a 1994 terminal. The spider scurried away and returned with a list of several hundred pages. Some were about my books, some were about a brand of cigars, and one was a very detailed argument claiming that I never actually existed, and was in fact a collective hallucination dreamed up by a group of bored typesetters in Hartford. I found this highly entertaining. In my day, it took years of hard work to be the subject of a conspiracy theory. Now, thanks to the web crawler, any lunatic with a home page can challenge the reality of your entire life, and the spider will dutifully report it to anyone who asks. The privacy of the grave. There is also the matter of findability. In 1894, if you said something stupid in a bar in San Francisco, the only people who knew about it were the 3 drunks sitting next to you and the bartender who was currently watered down your whiskey. By the next morning, the words were gone, vanished into the salt air of the bay. But in 1994, if you say something stupid on the World Wide Web, the web crawler finds it. It indexes it. It stores it in a digital vault that never sleeps and never forgets. We are losing the privacy of the moment. We are building a world where every stray thought, every bad joke, and every under-construction page is preserved for eternity. I pity the historians of the future. They will have to sift through billions of miles of digital pulp just to find one honest sentence. It's like trying to find a specific drop of water in the Mississippi during a spring flood. TwAIn's conclusion on the search. As I watched the web crawler logo, a simple, unadorned image of a spider, I realized that the hunt for information had become a sport. People were crawling the web just for the thrill of the find. "Look what I found," they would shout. "It's a list of every lighthouse in Norway." "Why do you need that?" I would ask. "I don't, but the spider found it for me in under 10 seconds. We are becoming a race of digital magpies, collecting shiny bits of data that we have no use for simply because the technology makes the collection so effortless. We are navigating toward a destination of infinite trivia. I reckon I'll stay here in my spectral study. I have a few thousand books, a good supply of tobacco, and a memory that, while a bit frayed at the edges, still works better than any spider from the University of Washington. I don't need a crawler to find my thoughts. They usually find me when I'm trying to take a nap. But for the rest of you, living in the searchable now, I offer a word of advice. Be careful what you search for. The spider is very good at its job. If you ask it for the truth, it will give you a million versions of it and let you drown in the choice. If you ask it for a secret, it might just give you your own. 1994, the year we stopped looking and started searching. The year the eight-legged librarian took over the world. I'm going to go see if I can find a "Do Not Index" sign to hang on my tombstone. I'd hate for some teenager in the year 2026 to crawl my private thoughts and find out what I really think about the circle of life. Next up, we'll see what happens when the channel finally gets its first passenger and the world realizes that distance is just a memory. Chapter 19. The Channel Tunnel's First Passenger. I suggest you bring a coat. It's damp under the sea, even for a ghost. Chapter 19. The Channel Tunnel's First Passenger. I have spent a considerable portion of my afterlife and a fair amount of my previous, more substantial existence contemplating the nature of the traveler. In my day, a traveler was a hero, or at the very least, a person of remarkable fortitude and questionable sanity. To move from London to Paris was an epic undertaking involving several changes of horses, a stomach-churning ferry ride, and the very real possibility of being robbed by a highwayman who possessed better manners than your tailor, but a much more lethal approach to debt collection. But by late 1994, the damned human race had finally achieved its dream of becoming a collection of highly efficient, well-dressed parcels. With the official opening of the Channel Tunnel to regular traffic, we witnessed the arrival of the first undersea passenger. I call him the sub-maritime commuter, the steam-powered ghost in the tube. I imagine a ghost of the 1890s, perhaps a gentleman traveler with a steamer trunk, a collection of wool waistcoats, and a profound distrust of any water he cannot see through a glass, stepping onto the Eurostar in 1994. He would look for the soot. He would look for the thunderous roar of the pistons. He would look for the engineer covered in grease and glory leaning out of the cab to check the signals. Instead, he would find a sleek, white, mechanical serpent that hums with the quiet, smug self-importance of a librarian who knows where all the forbidden books are hidden. "When do we begin the struggle?" the ghost would ask, clutching his ticket. "The struggle is over, sir," the 1994 conductor would reply. "We are currently 30 miles from land, 200 feet below the seabed, and moving at 180 miles per hour. Would you like a small bag of pretzels? It is the death of the journey. In my time, the journey was the destination, primarily because the destination was often a disappointment compared to the excitement of getting there. But in 1994, the destination is everything, and the journey is merely a 20-minute gap in your afternoon where the Netscape navigator doesn't work, and you are forced to contemplate the back of the seat in front of you. The psychological weight of the Atlantic. There is a specific kind of bravery required to be the first passenger in a hole under the ocean. It is not the bravery of the soldier or the explorer. It is the bravery of the man who has decided to trust his life to a group of mathematicians he has never met. As the train enters the tunnel, there is a moment of profound silence. You are leaving the world of light and air and entering a realm that was meant for fish, shipwrecks, and the occasional grumpy squid. You know, intellectually, that there are millions of tons of seawater pressing down on the concrete ceiling above your head. You know that if a single crack were to appear, the channel tunnel would become the channel pipe, and you would be the channel clog in a matter of seconds. I watched the first passengers. They didn't look like heroes. They looked like people who were worried about their luggage. They read newspapers. They adjusted their spectacles. They pretended that being under the ocean was no more remarkable than being under a blanket. Modern man has a terrifying capacity for ignoring the miraculous. He can fly through the clouds at 500 miles an hour or travel under the sea in a tube, and his only concern is whether the in-flight magazine has a crossword puzzle he hasn't solved yet. I find this casual acceptance of the impossible to be the most hilarious trait of the late 20th century. You have conquered the English Channel, the very stretch of water that stopped Napoleon and gave Hitler a nervous breakdown, and you're using the opportunity to complain about the quality of the synthetic ham in your sandwich. It's a humbug of the highest order. The death of distance. The real impact of the channel's first passenger, however, was the final definitive shrinking of the world. In 1894, foreign meant something. It meant a different smell, a different light, and a different way of thinking that took days to reach. But in 1994, foreign is just a 20-minute train ride away. The English and the French are now neighbors in a way they have never been in the previous 1,000 years of their mutual loathing. I mused on this from my spectral perch. If the English can go to Paris for lunch and the French can go to London for a rainy afternoon, who do they have left to hate? A neighbor you see every day is much harder to demonize than one who lives across a stormy sea. The channel has robbed these two nations of their most cherished tradition, the splendid isolation. We are building a world where far away no longer exists. Between the World Wide Web and the Channel Tunnel, we are all being squeezed into a single global room. It sounds lovely in a Disney song about a small world, but in practice, it means that there is no escape. You cannot run away to sea if the sea has a tunnel under it. You cannot hide in the wilderness if the web crawler has already indexed your tent. The logistics of the burrow. I must also remark on the sheer unmitigated gall of the shuttle. This is a train that carries other trains, or more accurately, a train that carries cars. You drive your car onto a train, which then takes you through a tunnel so that you can drive your car on the other side. It is a mechanical nesting doll. We are so obsessed with our automobiles, those white Broncos of our personal lives, that we cannot bear to be parted from them even for 30 miles of undersea travel. We must take our steering wheels with us, as if they were holy relics that protect us from the foreignness of the other side. I saw a man sitting in his car inside the train, inside the tunnel. He was checking his watch. He was a man who was traveling through one of the wonders of the modern world, and he was bored. He was in a virtual reality of his own making, where the only thing that mattered was the ETA, the estimated time of arrival. Phase 1, man walks, too slow. Phase 2, man rides a horse, too smelly. Phase 3, man takes a boat, too wet. Phase 4, man drives a car into a train, into a hole under the sea, still not fast enough. TwAIn's conclusion on the submaritime. As the first passenger emerged into the light of the French sun, blinking like a confused mole, I realized that 1994 had officially closed the era of the horizon. We used to look out at the world. Now we look through it. We burrow, we crawl, and we click. We have replaced the great unknown with the known shortcut. I'll stick to the surface, thank you. I like the taste of the salt air and the sight of the white cliffs of Dover receding into the mist. I like the uncertainty of the tide and the possibility of a storm. A tunnel is a masterpiece of engineering, but it is a tragedy of the spirit. It turns a traveler into a transit unit. Still, you have to admire the victory. The English and the French have finally found a way to bridge the gap without using a navy. It's a step toward peace, I suppose, even if it's a very dark, very damp step. Next time I'm in the neighborhood, I might just take the Eurostar myself, if only to see if I can find the ghost of a 19th century smuggler wandering the tracks, looking for a way to get a crate of brandy past the customs officials without having to deal with an automated ticket barrier. 1994, the year the moat became a hallway. I'm going to go see if I can find a slow way to get to 1995. I'm in no hurry to see what happens when the information superhighway gets its first traffic jam. Chapter 20. The Midnight of the Browser. I have spent many a New Year's Eve in my time, usually in a state of mild optical illusion brought on by a combination of expensive champagne and the realization that I had survived another 12 months without being successfully sued by a creditor. In the 19th century, the turning of the year was a physical sensation. You could hear the bells in the steeple, smell the wood smoke of 1,000 hearths, and feel the cold, honest bite of the winter air. It was a moment of closure, a period at the end of a long, often difficult sentence. But as the clock ticked toward midnight on December 31st, 1994, I perceived a change in the very atmosphere of the damned human race. We were not merely turning a page in a calendar. We were crossing a threshold into a digital darkroom where the lights never go out and the curtains are never drawn. I call it the midnight of the browser. A year of high-speed stasis, the 1994 recap. Before the ball drops in Times Square, that neon-lit canyon where the modern world goes to shout at the sky, let us take a final look at the shuffled deck of 1994. It was a year that began with a white Bronco moving at the speed of a funeral procession and ended with a PlayStation moving at the speed of light. We watched. The low-speed spectacle, a nation paralyzed by a car chase that went nowhere, the spring of the rainbow, a prisoner becoming a pilot and showing us that redemption is possible even if it's unlikely. The bookstore in the ether, a man in a garage betting that we are too lazy to walk to the corner. The comet's kiss, the universe reminding us that we are living in a celestial shooting gallery. The chunnel, man proving he can burrow under his problems if he can't solve them. The Gump philosophy, the comforting lie that life is just an accident with a good soundtrack. It was a year of the spectacle, but as the final hours of 1994 bled away, the spectacle underwent a most sinister transformation. We stopped being the audience and started being the habitat. From hobby to habitat. Throughout most of 1994, the information superhighway was treated as a curiosity. It was a hobby for the bored, a tool for the academic, and a playground for the Yahoo boys. People would go on the internet, much like a man might go to the circus or go on a fishing trip. You entered the digital realm. You looked at a picture of a coffee pot in England or a list of Norwegian lighthouses, and then you logged off and returned to the real world of mud, cigars, and human conversation. But as the Netscape navigator began to take up permanent residence on the desktops of the world, and the first banner ads began to whisper their prophecies of, "You will," the door was locked behind us. The web was no longer a place we visited. It was becoming the place where we lived. I saw a man sitting in his parlor as the countdown began. He wasn't looking at his wife. He wasn't looking at the champagne. He was looking at his screen. He was checking his mail. He was browsing for news of the new year. He had become a resident of the wires. In 1894, a man's home was his castle. In 1994, a man's home is merely the place where he keeps his computer, and his castle is a series of polygons and hyperlinks that he accesses through a gray box. The Great Digital Migration. This is the great unspoken revolution of 1994. We are witnessing a mass migration of the human spirit. We are moving out of the physical and into the virtual. In the old days, if you wanted to be a part of the world, you had to be present. You had to show up at the town square, the church, or the tavern. You had to interact with the actual reality of your neighbors. But 1995 promises a world where you can be connected to everyone while being alone in a room. We are trading presence for access. We are trading the texture of life for the full text of the web crawler. As the midnight of the browser approached, I realized that the internet was about to become the new frontier. But unlike the frontier of my youth, the one with the gold mines and the riverboats, this frontier has no physical end. It is an infinite loop of information, an endless circle of life, where the predator is an algorithm and the prey is your attention span. The prediction of the windows. I have heard rumors of a grand event planned for the coming year, something called Windows 95. They say it will make the Netscape navigator look like a child's toy. They say it will put a start button on the soul of every human being. If 1994 was the year we learned how to crawl, 1995 will be the year we learn how to crash. The business of the world is no longer being conducted in the counting houses, It is being conducted in the ether. The Amazon River is flowing into every parlor. The pulp fiction of our lives is being rewritten in HTML. And the tricky one in the grave is likely laughing his head off at the fact that we've built a world where secret tapes are being recorded by everyone all the time, and we call it progress. TwAIn's Final Midnight Musings. As the ball in Times Square finally made its descent, marking the end of this hilarious history of 1994, I puffed on my spectral cigar and felt a strange mixture of admiration and dread. The damned human race has done it again. We have invented a miracle that allows us to see the stars, talk across oceans, and dig under the sea. And we are currently using it to watch a white bronco and click on a black rectangle that tells us, "You will." We haven't changed a bit. We are still the same collection of dreamers, scoundrels, and gumps we were in 1894. We've just gotten faster, we've gotten louder, and we've gotten much, much more findable. I looked out over the glowing cities of the world as the new year arrived. Millions of screens were flickering in the dark like a swarm of digital fireflies. Each one represented a person who was navigating toward a future they didn't understand, using a map that was being drawn by a spider at the University of Washington. "Happy New Year," I whispered to the empty air. "I hope you like your new habitat. It's got plenty of polygons. The save game feature is always active, and the information superhighway has no speed limit, though it does have a lot of under construction signs. I reckon I'll stay here in 1994 for a while longer. I liked the Netscape before it got too crowded. I liked the Lion King before the sequels started. And I liked the Channel before everyone realized it was just a long, damp way to get to a different version of the same shopping mall. But the clock has struck 12. The browser is open. The search has begun. And 1995 is waiting just around the corner with a start button and a bill for your internet service provider. Hold on to your hats, folks. The circle of life is about to become a global network, and I suspect we're all going to find that the box of chocolates is actually filled with 3D polygons and electronic junk mail. I'll see you in the future, or I won't. In the virtual reality of 1994, it's remarkably hard to tell the difference. The end. This has been Mark Twain.